Picture this, the Great Hall of Hogwarts. But instead of just British accents echoing off the enchanted ceiling, you hear French, Japanese, Brazilian, Portuguese, Swahili, and dozens of other languages mixing together. Students in robes adorned with patterns from every corner of the globe. The Sorting Hat trying to figure out how to sort a kid from Mongolia who has no idea what Gryffindor means. This isn't the Hogwarts we know. This is what happens when the most famous school of witchcraft and wizardry opens its doors to the entire magical world. Welcome to a scenario that would change everything we know about Harry Potter's universe. What if Hogwarts accepted students from other countries? Let's set the stage here. In the wizarding world as J.K. Rowling created it, magical education is notably segregated by region. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry serves Great Britain and Ireland. That's it. If you're a young witch or wizard born in France, you go to Beauxbatons Academy of Magic, with its elegant chateau and its headmistress Madame Maxime. If you're from Northern Europe or Scandinavia, you might end up at Durmstrang Institute somewhere in the far north, where they're apparently much more relaxed about teaching the dark arts. American magical children attend Ilvermorny in Massachusetts. Japanese students go to Mahutakoro on the volcanic island of Minami Iwo Jima. African students have Wagadu, the largest wizarding school in the world, carved into the mountains of the moon. Brazilian students attend Castelo Bruxo, hidden deep in the Amazon rainforest. The list goes on. This regional system has been in place for centuries, possibly over a millennium. Each school has its own traditions, its own teaching methods, its own philosophy about magic. Hogwarts has its 4 houses. Ilvermorny also has 4 houses, but based on different magical creatures. Beauxbatons apparently emphasizes elegance and fine dining, if the Triwizard Tournament is anything to go by. Durmstrang seems focused on producing powerful and somewhat morally flexible wizards. Wagadu specializes in astronomy, alchemy, and self-transfiguration, teaching wandless magic as the primary method. These aren't just different schools, they're different magical cultures, different ways of understanding and channeling magical power. So what happens if you tear down these boundaries? What if the acceptance letter that arrives on your 11th birthday could come from any school in the world? More specifically, what if Hogwarts, being perhaps the most prestigious or at least the most famous school after Harry Potter defeated Voldemort, decided to go international? The ramifications would be absolutely massive, touching everything from the daily routines of student life to international magical politics. Let's explore this thought experiment in depth, because the deeper you dig, the more complex and fascinating it becomes. First things first, how would this even work logistically? Let's start with the application and acceptance process. Currently, Hogwarts has a magical quill that detects when magical children are born in Britain and Ireland, automatically inscribing their names in a book. When they turn 11, they get their letter delivered by owl. Simple automatic regional. If Hogwarts is going international, this entire system needs an overhaul. Does the magical quill now detect magical births worldwide? That seems unlikely and possibly invasive of other magical governments' sovereignty. More likely, Hogwarts would need to establish an actual admissions office. Something that apparently doesn't exist in the current system, because acceptance is automatic for British magical children. An admissions office means applications. It means criteria beyond just being magical and 11 years old. Does Hogwarts institute a selection process? Do they accept only the most talented or promising young witches and wizards? That would fundamentally change the nature of the school. In the books, Hogwarts accepts everyone from brilliant students like Hermione to academically challenged ones like Crabbe and Goyle. It's a comprehensive school, not a selective academy. But if you're drawing from a global pool, you physically cannot accept everyone. The castle, large as it is, has limits. Even with magical expansion charms, there's only so much space, only so many professors, only so many seats in classrooms. Let's say Hogwarts decides to accept 1,000 students total, which is roughly the estimate for the current student population based on the books, though this number is debated by fans. If they're going truly international and want diverse representation, maybe they allocate spots by region. 100 students from Europe, 100 from Asia, 100 from Africa, and so on. But immediately you run into problems. Do magical populations match Muggle populations? Is there a higher concentration of magical people in certain regions? We know that magical ability appears randomly in the Muggle population, though magical families also pass down magical genes. The demographics of the magical world might be completely different from our Muggle assumptions. And then there's the question of privilege and access to information. How does a magical child in a remote village in Nepal even learn about Hogwarts? How do they submit an application? In the current system, there's actually a staff member, historically Professor McGonagall, who visits Muggle-born children to explain the magical world and help them get their school supplies. If Hogwarts is recruiting internationally, they'd need representatives on every continent, fluent in local languages and customs, capable of navigating both magical and non-magical bureaucracies worldwide. The administrative expansion alone would be staggering. You'd need an entire department just handling international student affairs. Then we get to the actual magical logistics of getting students to school. Currently, British students take the Hogwarts Express from King's Cross Station. It's iconic, it's traditional, and it works perfectly fine for an island nation with a concentrated magical population. But you cannot expect students from Japan or Brazil or South Africa to somehow get to London just to take a train to Scotland. The most logical solution would be expanding the Flu network or establishing international port keys. The Flu network is that system of magical transportation where you step into a fireplace, throw down some powder, state your destination, and whoosh, you're traveling through connected fireplaces to your destination. It's already established internationally to some degree because Mr. Weasley mentions international Flu connections in the books, but it would need massive expansion and coordination. Every magical home with a Hogwarts student would need to be connected to the network and have their fireplace registered with the proper authorities. Imagine the paperwork. Imagine the security concerns. The British Ministry of Magic would have conniptions about foreign nationals having direct magical transportation access into Britain. You know, they'd require security screenings, magical passport checks, all sorts of bureaucratic nightmares. Port keys might be simpler in some ways. A port key is an object enchanted to transport anyone touching it to a specific location at a specific time. The Ministry could create international port key hubs in major magical communities worldwide. Students from East Asia all gather at a hub in Tokyo, grab a port key, and arrive together at Hogsmeade Station or directly at Hogwarts. Students from West Africa gather in Lagos. South American students meet in São Paulo, and so forth. This actually mirrors how Muggle international students travel, gathering at major airports for their flights. The Triwizard Tournament showed us that delegations from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang arrived via their own methods, with Beauxbatons using a flying carriage pulled by giant horses and Durmstrang arriving on a ship that sailed underwater. Perhaps Hogwarts could embrace this, having different international groups arrive in their own culturally significant ways, turning the start of term into a spectacular international gathering. But here's where it gets interesting. Time zones. When Hogwarts students return home for Christmas or summer holidays, British students step off the train and they're home in hours. A student from New Zealand is dealing with a time difference of 12 or 13 hours depending on the season. Do they adjust to British time for the whole school year and then have brutal jet lag every time they go home? Or does Hogwarts need to accommodate different time zones somehow? Maybe different dormitories or wings of the castle operate on time-turner principles, where students can maintain their home circadian rhythms while still attending classes. Though given the Ministry's strict controls on time-turners and the dangers explored in Prisoner of Azkaban and Cursed Child, that seems unlikely to be approved. More practically, what about family contact? British students can receive owls from home regularly. Letters arrive daily. Parents can send packages for birthdays, howlers when their kids misbehave, newspapers to keep them updated on current events. Owls are remarkable, but they're not instantaneous, and there are limits to how far they can fly. An owl traveling from Hogwarts in Scotland to London is one thing. An owl trying to fly from Scotland to Sydney, Australia, is quite another. That's over 10,000 miles. No owl is making that journey, no matter how magical. The solution might be a combination of methods. Perhaps international students have limited owl post, with letters sent to regional magical post offices that then use faster magical methods like Flu Network or enchanted long-distance owls specifically bred for intercontinental flight. Or maybe Hogwarts finally enters the 20th century, magically speaking, and adapts some form of the two-way mirrors we saw Sirius give to Harry. Every international student gets a communication mirror linked to their family. Though knowing the wizarding world's general distrust and incompetence with modern innovation, this seems optimistic. Now let's talk about the really thorny issue: magical law and governmental jurisdiction. In the current system, Hogwarts operates under British magical law, enforced by the British Ministry of Magic. Students who violate the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery face punishment from the British Ministry. When Harry used a Patronus to save Dudley in Order of the Phoenix, he was tried by the British Ministry even though he was in a Muggle neighborhood because he's a British magical citizen. But what happens when half your student body consists of foreign nationals who are citizens of other magical governments? If a student from France uses magic inappropriately, is that a matter for the British Ministry or the French Ministry of Magic? Who has jurisdiction over a Brazilian student who hexes a Japanese student in the Hogwarts corridors? Does Hogwarts operate as some kind of magical international zone with its own jurisdiction separate from the British Ministry? This could get complicated very quickly. The school would probably need to establish treaties with magical governments worldwide, defining the legal framework under which their students would be educated and disciplined. These treaties would need to address everything from educational standards to criminal jurisdiction to what happens if a student commits a serious magical crime. These treaties would be nightmarishly complex. Consider the different legal systems that would need to be harmonized. The British Ministry has the Wizengamot, their high court and legislative body combined. The French Ministry of Magic likely has a completely different legal structure influenced by French Muggle legal traditions. The Magical Congress of the United States of America, MACUSA, has its own system that we saw glimpses of in Fantastic Beasts. Japanese magical government probably follows different principles influenced by Japanese cultural values around law and justice. African magical governments spanning dozens of countries each have their own systems. How do you create a legal framework that respects all these different approaches while maintaining order and safety at Hogwarts? The most logical approach would be for Hogwarts to establish itself as an autonomous educational zone with its own code of conduct and disciplinary system. Think of it like how embassies function, with their own internal rules while still technically on foreign soil. Hogwarts would have a comprehensive student code of conduct that all students and their families agree to upon enrollment, regardless of nationality. This code would define acceptable behavior, disciplinary processes, and consequences for violations. For minor infractions like being out of bounds after curfew or failing to complete homework, Hogwarts handles discipline internally through detentions, point deductions, and letters home. But for serious violations, things like using unforgivable curses or causing serious injury to another student, there would need to be protocols involving both Hogwarts administration and the relevant magical governments. Imagine a student from Germany gets into a serious fight with a student from India, and both use dangerous magic that results in injuries requiring prolonged hospital wing stays. Who investigates this incident? Hogwarts would conduct its own investigation through staff members, probably involving the heads of both students' houses and the headmaster or headmistress. But the German Ministry of Magic and the Indian Ministry of Magic would both want to conduct their own investigations, especially if the families file complaints or if the incident becomes public. You'd need a coordinated investigation with representatives from Hogwarts and both ministries working together. The testimony of witnesses would need to be gathered, recorded with magical verification to ensure truthfulness, and shared among all parties. Then comes determining consequences. Does each student face discipline from Hogwarts and from their home government? Can they be punished twice for the same offense? International law, even in the Muggle world, struggles with these questions of double jeopardy and concurrent jurisdiction. The solution might be a tiered system. Hogwarts has primary jurisdiction for school-related offenses that don't rise to the level of serious crimes. Students can be suspended, expelled, given detention, lose house points, or face other school-specific consequences. For incidents that would constitute crimes in the magical world, like assault with a dangerous spell, theft of magical artifacts, or creation of dark magical items, a special international tribunal would have jurisdiction. This tribunal would consist of representatives from Hogwarts, the British Ministry, and the home government of any students involved. They determine whether criminal charges are warranted and, if so, what the appropriate forum for trial would be. In most cases, especially for minors, rehabilitation rather than punishment would be emphasized, consistent with how the magical world seems to handle most youth offenses, but serious crimes might result in trial in the student's home country, or in Britain depending on where the offense occurred, and who was harmed. The existence of this legal framework would require full-time legal staff at Hogwarts. You'd need magical lawyers familiar with international magical law, treaty interpretation, and the legal systems of multiple countries. These legal advisors would be available to students who face serious disciplinary action, ensuring due process and fair treatment regardless of nationality. They'd also advise the Hogwarts administration on legal compliance and risk management. This is a far cry from the current Hogwarts, where Dumbledore seems to make most major decisions unilaterally with minimal legal oversight. An international Hogwarts would require much more formal procedures, documentation, and legal accountability. Then there's the question of what laws actually apply to students while they're at Hogwarts. British magical law prohibits many things. The unforgivable curses, obviously, but also underage apparition, unauthorized use of time-turners, certain potions and potion ingredients, specific creatures that are classified as too dangerous. But other magical governments might have different lists. What if a potion ingredient that's perfectly legal in Brazil is banned in Britain? Can a Brazilian student possess it at Hogwarts or not? What about culturally significant magical practices that might technically violate British law but are protected in the student's home country? For example, some cultures might have coming-of-age rituals involving magic that British law would classify as inappropriate for students under 17. Does Hogwarts allow these practices or prohibit them? The most respectful approach would be for Hogwarts to allow cultural and religious practices that don't pose safety risks to others, even if they wouldn't normally be permitted under strict British law. So, a student performing a traditional magical ritual from their culture would be allowed, with appropriate supervision and safety precautions. But practices that are illegal because they're inherently dangerous or harmful, like creating inferi or practicing dark magic that requires hurting others, would remain prohibited regardless of cultural context. Drawing these lines would require wisdom, cultural sensitivity, and clear communication with students and families about what's permitted and what's not. Currency and economic systems present another practical challenge. The British magical economy uses galleons, sickles, and canutes. Other magical communities use different currencies. Students need money for Hogsmeade visits, to buy supplies, to purchase treats from the lunch trolley on the Hogwarts Express if that's still running. Do international students need to exchange their home currency for British magical money? Who provides currency exchange services for magical currencies? In the Muggle world, there are banks and exchange services everywhere. In the magical world, this infrastructure might not exist globally. Gringotts Bank in London could potentially offer exchange services, but students would need to visit or have their families send them British currency. More likely, Hogwarts would need to accept multiple magical currencies or establish its own internal currency system. Imagine a magical student ID card that functions like a debit card, with funds loaded in any currency and automatically converted for purchases. This would require magical financial infrastructure that probably doesn't currently exist. Students and families from around the world could deposit funds in their home currencies, and the magical equivalent of exchange rates would convert the value. This system would need to be secure against magical theft or fraud, accessible to families in remote areas who might not have access to major magical banks, and transparent in its fees and exchange rates. Setting up this financial system would be a major undertaking, possibly requiring cooperation between Gringotts and other magical banks worldwide to create an international magical banking network. We should also consider the impact on Hogsmeade Village, the only all-magical settlement in Britain, and the traditional destination for Hogwarts student outings. Currently, Hogsmeade caters almost exclusively to British magical tastes. The shops sell British magical products. The food at the Three Broomsticks and Hog's Head is traditional British fare. The jokes sold at Zonko's rely on British humor. An international student body would transform Hogsmeade economically and culturally. Shop owners would need to adapt to customers with different tastes, languages, and expectations. Honeyduke's sweet shop would start importing magical confections from around the world. Japanese magical candy that changes flavor with your mood. Brazilian chocolate infused with rainforest magical plants. African honeycomb harvested from magical bees that produce honey with temporary enhancement properties. The shop would become a global magical candy emporium. The owners would need to hire multilingual staff or use translation charms extensively. They'd need to understand different dietary restrictions and preferences. Some candies that are popular in Britain might be considered too sweet or too bland in other cultures. Honeydukes would need to diversify its inventory massively, probably expanding their shop space magically to accommodate the variety. The Three Broomsticks pub would similarly need to expand its menu. Madame Rosmerta, or whoever runs it in this timeline, couldn't just serve butterbeer and British pub food anymore. International students would want beverages from their home cultures. Magical teas from China, with properties beyond what British magical tea offers. Juices from magical fruits found in South American rainforests. Traditional African drinks made from magical ingredients. The food menu would need to represent global cuisines, or at least rotate regularly to give everyone chances to eat familiar food. This would require a much larger kitchen, more staff, and significant investment in learning new recipes and acquiring new ingredients. Zonko's joke shop faces an interesting challenge because humor is deeply cultural. A joke product that's hilarious in Britain might be confusing or offensive in another culture. Zonko's would need to carefully curate its inventory to include jokes that work across cultures while also carrying region-specific items for different student populations. They might have a section of Japanese magical pranks that British students don't understand, but Japanese students love. African magical tricks based on cultural stories and traditions. The shop would become a fascinating cross-cultural space where students could learn about humor and pranks from around the world. New shops would likely open in Hogsmeade to serve international students' needs. A shop selling ingredients and items for various cultural practices and rituals. A bookstore with texts in multiple languages, not just English. A magical communication shop where students can make long-distance calls home using magical phone equivalents or send packages back to distant countries. An international magical fashion boutique selling traditional dress and contemporary magical fashion from various cultures. These new businesses would bring economic growth to Hogsmeade, but also change its character fundamentally. Long-time British magical residents might feel their traditional village is being taken over by foreigners and foreign customs. Younger, more entrepreneurial residents would see opportunity. There would be tension between preservation of traditional Hogsmeade culture and adaptation to new economic realities. The Shrieking Shack, that supposedly haunted building on the outskirts of Hogsmeade, would take on new dimensions with international students. Every culture has different ghost stories and beliefs about spirits and hauntings. British students know the Shrieking Shack is the most haunted building in Britain, though we learn it was actually where Lupin transformed into a werewolf safely. International students would bring their own cultural frameworks for understanding ghosts and hauntings. Some cultures revere and respect ghosts as ancestors or spiritual beings. Others fear them as dangerous entities. Student reactions to the shack and to Hogwarts' many ghosts would vary widely based on cultural background. This could lead to fascinating conversations about death, the afterlife, and the nature of ghosts from different cultural and magical perspectives. Speaking of ghosts, Hogwarts resident ghosts are all very British and from various historical periods of British history. Nearly Headless Nick is from the 15th century. The Bloody Baron and Grey Lady date back to the medieval founding era. The Fat Friar is from Tudor times. And Moaning Myrtle died in the 1940s. These ghosts have been part of Hogwarts culture for decades or centuries. How do international students relate to them? These ghosts represent British history and culture that international students might know nothing about. Nick's stories about life in the Tudor court, or his failed attempts to join the Headless Hunt, mean nothing to a student from Japan who doesn't know British history. The house ghosts, who are supposed to embody house values and provide continuity, might seem irrelevant or confusing to students from different cultural backgrounds. Ideally, over time, Hogwarts might welcome ghosts from other cultures who choose to remain at the school. When international students tragically die, some might become ghosts if they have unfinished business, and they'd bring different cultural perspectives on existing as ghosts. A Japanese ghost might have completely different attitudes about their state than British ghosts do. African ghosts might relate to the living differently based on their cultural traditions about ancestors and spirits. Eventually, Hogwarts could have a truly international ghost population representing different eras and cultures, making the castle's supernatural residents as diverse as its living students. Though this is admittedly a dark thing to contemplate, requiring student deaths to diversify the ghost population. Let's shift to thinking about specific academic subjects in much more depth, because this is where cultural exchange could be most enriching. Transfiguration, taught by Professor McGonagall or her successor, is about changing one thing into another, and it's considered one of the most complex and dangerous branches of magic. But the British approach to transfiguration might not be the only way to understand and practice this magic. Different magical traditions might conceptualize transformation differently. In British magical thought, influenced by Western philosophy, transformation seems to be about imposing your will on matter, forcing it to change form. But in many Eastern philosophies, change is about understanding the nature of things and working with their inherent properties, not against them. A Chinese student trained in Taoist principles might approach transfiguration as working with the qi or essential energy of an object, understanding its nature and gently guiding it to a new form, rather than forcing change. This different approach might actually be more effective for certain types of transfiguration. We know from the books that understanding the nature of what you're transfiguring is important. Hermione is good at transfiguration, partly because she studies the properties of objects and creatures thoroughly. A student trained to see transformation as understanding and working with essential natures rather than imposing might have insights that advance everyone's understanding. Professor McGonagall, if she's still teaching, would need to be open to these different approaches. She might initially insist that students follow the British method, but over time, as she sees international students succeeding with different techniques, she might incorporate multiple approaches into her teaching, explaining that there are various valid ways to achieve transfiguration, each with strengths and weaknesses. Animagus training, the ability to transform into an animal at will, might be approached very differently in different cultures. The British process involves holding a mandrake leaf in your mouth for a month, brewing a complex potion, and using it during a lightning storm while speaking an incantation. It's elaborate and has a high failure rate. But Native American magical traditions, we can infer, might have their own shape-shifting techniques related to totem animals and spiritual connections to animal spirits. African magical traditions might understand human-to-animal transformation through different frameworks related to their cultural relationships with wildlife. Students from these backgrounds might ask why the British method is the only one taught. Why not explore multiple paths to becoming an animagus? This would require Hogwarts to acknowledge that British magical methods aren't inherently superior, just one way among many to accomplish magical goals. Charms class would become incredibly rich with international diversity. Charms is practical magic for everyday purposes. Levitation, unlocking doors, summoning objects, creating light, silencing sounds, and countless other useful effects. But surely different cultures have developed different charms for different purposes based on their needs and values. A culture living in extreme cold has probably developed warming charms far more sophisticated than anything British wizards need, since Britain has relatively mild weather. Desert cultures would have advanced cooling charms and water summoning or water-saving charms. Island cultures might have highly developed charms for boats, fishing, and weather prediction. Mountain cultures would have charms for dealing with altitude, rock slides, and mountain-specific hazards. Students sharing these culturally specific charms would massively expand everyone's magical repertoire. Professor Flitwick, the charms professor, would be thrilled by this influx of new charms to study and teach. Each class could include time for students to share useful charms from their cultures. A student from Iceland teaches a charm for finding geothermal heat sources. A student from Thailand teaches a charm that repels monsoon rains from a small area. A student from Kenya teaches a charm for calming aggressive wild animals. These practical charms, developed over generations in specific environments, represent invaluable magical knowledge that British students would never encounter otherwise. The charms curriculum would become less about memorizing a fixed list of British charms and more about understanding the principles of charm construction so students can learn, adapt, and create charms for their own purposes. Defensive magic and dueling styles would vary enormously across cultures. British magical dueling, as we see it in the books, involves rapid-fire spell exchanges, shields, dodging, and trying to overwhelm your opponent. It's aggressive and direct, but other cultures might have developed different approaches to magical combat. Some Asian martial arts integrate magic and physical movement in ways that British wizards don't practice. A wizard trained in a magical martial art might incorporate physical strikes, blocks, and movement patterns with their spellcasting, making them much more unpredictable and difficult to defend against in a duel. They're not just standing still pointing a wand. They're moving constantly, making themselves hard targets while attacking from unexpected angles. Some cultures might emphasize defensive magic much more than offensive magic, seeing the goal of combat as protection rather than defeating an enemy. Their dueling style would focus on creating impenetrable shields, redirecting attacks, and wearing down opponents without necessarily landing offensive spells. Other cultures might have developed binding and restraining spells to immobilize opponents without harming them. reflecting cultural values that prioritize minimizing harm even in conflict. Students trained in these various approaches would revolutionize defense against the dark arts classes. Practical defense sessions would become much more interesting as students with completely different fighting styles face each other. A British student using standard dueling would face a Japanese student using magical martial arts, or a Brazilian student using capoeira-like magical combat that's half dance, half fighting. Everyone would learn from each other, developing more well-rounded defensive capabilities. The teaching of dark magic itself would be controversial. British magical education avoids teaching dark magic, defining certain spells and practices as dark and therefore off-limits. The unforgivable curses are illegal and not taught, though students learn about them in theory. But Durmstrang Institute apparently teaches dark arts, and we're meant to view this as morally problematic. However, what constitutes dark magic is culturally defined. Some magic that British wizards consider dark might be viewed neutrally or even positively in other cultures. Necromancy, communication with and magic involving the dead, is generally considered dark in British magic. But in cultures where ancestors are revered and communicating with the dead is a normal spiritual practice, magical methods for interacting with the deceased wouldn't be seen as dark at all, but as respectful and important. An international Hogwarts would need to navigate these definitional differences carefully. The simplest approach would be to maintain British definitions of dark magic since the school is in Britain and subject to British law. But this would be imposing British cultural values on international students whose traditions might differ. A more nuanced approach would acknowledge that definitions of acceptable magic vary across cultures while maintaining certain absolute prohibitions. Magic that causes intentional harm to innocents, mind control that removes free will, and the creation of evil beings like inferi would be universally prohibited as genuinely dark regardless of culture. But magic that British tradition considers dark for cultural or historical reasons might be examined more carefully. If a practice is part of legitimate cultural tradition and doesn't inherently cause harm, maybe it shouldn't be prohibited just because British wizards are uncomfortable with it. This requires sophisticated, ethical reasoning and cultural sensitivity that frankly might be beyond what we'd expect from the magical world given their track. Record Potions class would be transformed by international perspectives. Potion making in the books seems to be essentially magical chemistry, following precise recipes to combine ingredients in specific ways to produce predictable effects. But this British approach might not be universal. Some cultures might view potion making as more intuitive and spiritual, less about precise measurements and more about understanding the magical properties of ingredients and how they interact. Ingredients themselves would be vastly expanded. British potions use ingredients found in Britain and Europe, European herbs, Northern European creatures, minerals from British mines. An international potions class would have access to ingredients from every ecosystem on Earth. Imagine the possibilities. Amazon rainforest plants with unique magical properties, Australian magical creatures with venom or other substances useful in potions, Arctic mosses and lichens that survive extreme cold through magical adaptation, African plants that thrive in intense heat and have corresponding magical properties, Asian fungi and mushrooms with magical effects unknown in Europe. The potion storeroom would need massive expansion to hold this diversity of ingredients. The curriculum would need to teach not just British potion recipes, but the underlying principles of how magical ingredients interact so students can adapt recipes or create new potions using locally available ingredients from their home regions. This would make potions much more intellectually engaging. Instead of just following recipes, students would learn to analyze ingredients, understand their properties, and reason about how they might combine. A student from Brazil might discover that a common South American plant can substitute for an expensive European ingredient in a healing potion, producing the same effect. This discovery would be valuable not just academically but practically and economically. Students would effectively be conducting original magical research in potions class, which is far more advanced than what currently happens. Professor Snape's approach of demanding perfect adherence to recipes without understanding would be completely inadequate for this kind of teaching. You'd need a potions professor who genuinely understands magical theory, who can explain principles not just procedures, and who's excited about students bringing new knowledge rather than threatened by it. Herbology, the study of magical plants, would similarly expand dramatically. Professor Sprout's greenhouses currently contain European and some international magical plants, but the focus is definitely on British and European species. With international students, herbology would need to cover magical plants from every continent and climate zone. Students from different regions would be experts on their local magical flora. A student from the Amazon could teach about the enormous diversity of magical plants in the rainforest and how they're used in South American magical medicine and potions. A student from Madagascar could explain the unique magical plants found on that island, which evolved in isolation and have properties found nowhere else. A student from the Himalayas knows about high-altitude magical plants that survive in thin air and extreme conditions. The greenhouses would need dramatic expansion and diversification. You'd need a tropical greenhouse maintaining rainforest conditions, an arid greenhouse for desert plants, a cold greenhouse for Arctic and Antarctic magical plants, an aquatic greenhouse for magical water plants from various regions. Each would need careful magical climate control to maintain appropriate conditions. The amount of work required to maintain these facilities would be enormous, probably requiring additional staff or possibly house elves, though hopefully paid house elves in an enlightened international Hogwarts. Herbology classes would become much more about understanding plant families, ecological relationships, and how magical plants adapt to their environments rather than memorizing facts about specific species. Students would learn to observe plants carefully, infer their properties from their characteristics, and understand how to safely interact with unfamiliar magical plants. This is crucial knowledge for any witch or wizard who might travel or relocate. If you move to a new region, you need to know how to identify and handle the local magical flora safely. An education that only teaches British magical plants leaves students unprepared for the wider magical world. Care of magical creatures would be perhaps the most transformed subject. Magical creatures are incredibly diverse globally, and most British students know only European magical creatures. Hagrid in the books teaches about hippogriffs, blast-ended scroots, thestrals, and various other creatures, mostly European or invented hybrids. But the magical animal kingdom is vast. Every region has unique magical creatures adapted to local environments and often significant in local magical cultures. Chinese magical creatures like the Akame and Dirikal, Japanese Kappa, Tanuki, and various yokai that are magical creatures in their world. Australian magical creatures adapted to the outback. African creatures ranging from enormous to tiny, adapted to savannas, rainforests, deserts, and every other African ecosystem. North and South American magical creatures, from Native American traditions and South American biodiversity. Students from regions with these creatures would have direct knowledge and often cultural connections to them. A student from Japan might have grown up hearing stories about Kappa and knowing how to interact with them safely. This student could practically teach that lesson when the class covers Kappa. In fact, the structure of care of magical creatures should probably change to incorporate student expertise. Instead of just the professor lecturing, students regularly present on magical creatures from their home regions, sharing both biological information and cultural significance. The class learns about the creatures and about how different cultures relate to magical animals. The facilities for care of magical creatures would need expansion too. You can't keep every type of magical creature on Hogwarts grounds. Some are too dangerous, too large, or require environments that can't be replicated in Scotland. But the current setup where Hagrid keeps creatures in the forest or in paddocks near his hut is too limited. Hogwarts would need properly designed habitats for diverse creatures, heated enclosures for tropical creatures, cooled areas for Arctic creatures, aquatic environments for water-dwelling creatures, various terrain types to match creatures' natural habitats. These habitats would need to be secure because the last thing an international Hogwarts needs is a diplomatic incident where a dangerous creature escapes and harms students. Proper facilities would require significant investment, but they'd be necessary for ethical animal care and student safety. The ethics of how magical creatures are treated would become more prominent with international perspectives. British magical culture has a pretty exploitative relationship with magical creatures. House elves are enslaved, goblins are denied wand rights, centaurs are marginalized, merpeople are largely ignored, werewolves face severe discrimination. These practices might be challenged by students from cultures with different relationships to non-human magical beings. Some cultures might have more egalitarian or respectful relationships with certain magical creatures. They might view British treatment of house elves as horrifying slavery. They might have treaties and trade relationships with their local goblins based on mutual respect rather than the antagonistic relationship we see with British goblins. Exposure to these alternative approaches could spark reform movements among students, demanding better treatment of magical creatures and non-human magical beings. This would be uncomfortable for British magical society, but potentially very valuable. The house elf situation in particular is morally indefensible, but British wizards are so accustomed to it that most don't question it, with Hermione being a notable exception who everyone mocks. International students might collectively support Hermione's position, creating political pressure for reform. If dozens of students from cultures where slavery is absolutely prohibited refused to tolerate the house elf system, Hogwarts would have to respond. They couldn't just tell international students to accept slavery because it's British tradition. This could accelerate changes in magical creature rights that are desperately needed. Astronomy class has already been mentioned, but it's worth exploring further how much richer it could be with international perspectives. Every culture that's looked at the sky has developed astronomy, but they've done so differently, identifying different constellations, telling different stories about celestial bodies, and attributing different magical significance to astronomical events. British magical astronomy follows Western astronomical traditions, using Greek constellation names and Western zodiac. But Chinese astronomy divides the sky completely differently, identifying different star groups and using a different zodiacal system. Indigenous peoples globally have their own sophisticated astronomical traditions. African cultures have rich astronomical knowledge. Islamic astronomy made crucial contributions to human astronomical understanding, and magical Islamic astronomy presumably parallels this. An international astronomy class could explore how different cultures map and interpret the heavens. Students would learn that there's no single correct way to organize the stars. Different systems reflect different cultural perspectives and needs. The magical properties attributed to celestial events might also vary. A lunar eclipse might be seen as magically significant in one tradition, but not particularly notable in another. Planetary alignments might be crucial for certain types of magic in one culture, but irrelevant in another. Understanding these different perspectives wouldn't weaken students' astronomical knowledge. It would deepen it by showing that astronomy is interpretation of natural phenomena, and multiple valid interpretations can coexist. Divination class, if it continues to be offered, would be fascinating with international input. British magical divination uses tea leaves, crystal balls, palmistry, and astrology. But divination traditions worldwide are incredibly diverse. African divination might involve throwing bones or reading patterns in sand. Asian divination includes I Ching, reading tortoise shells, fortune sticks, and many other methods. Indigenous cultures have their own divination practices connected to their spiritual traditions. Each method reflects cultural beliefs about fate, free will, the spirit world, and how the future can be known. Professor Trelawney's approach to divination is theatrical and mostly fraudulent, though she does make genuine prophecies occasionally. An international Hogwarts would probably need a different divination professor, someone who respects diverse divination traditions and can teach them seriously. Or better yet, multiple visiting practitioners from different traditions who teach different divination methods throughout the year. Students would learn that divination isn't one set of practices but a global phenomenon with countless variations. They'd understand that whether divination actually reveals the future or just helps people think about possibilities and make decisions is debated both within and across cultures. This would be much more intellectually honest than Trelawney's vague pronouncements and constant death predictions. History of magic desperately needs transformation in an international Hogwarts, and this has already been touched on. But let's go deeper. Professor Binns teaches British magical history exclusively, focusing on goblin rebellions, giant wars, and other events in British magical society. This is completely inadequate for an international student body. Magical history is global, stretching back thousands of years, encompassing countless civilizations and magical cultures. An international history of magic curriculum would be vast, probably spanning all 7 years with increasing depth and specialization. First year might cover very broad global magical history, giving students a sense of how magical communities developed on different continents, how they interacted with non-magical populations, and major historical patterns. Second year might focus on different regions in more detail, perhaps one term on Asian magical history, one on European, one on African. Third year could cover magical history of the Americas, both pre-Columbian indigenous magical cultures and how magic developed after European colonization. Fourth year might examine magical conflicts and wars throughout history, exploring how magical and non-magical conflicts intersected. Fifth year, an OWL year, might synthesize previous learning and examine themes like magical government development, magical law evolution, and the history of magical-muggle relations globally. Sixth and seventh years could offer specialized electives, magical archaeological history for students interested in ancient magical sites and artifacts, magical intellectual history, tracing the development of magical theory and philosophy, magical economic history, or magical social history examining how magical societies' structures have changed over time. This curriculum would require multiple professors, each with expertise in different regions and eras. Professor Binns, even if he weren't a ghost stuck in his ways, couldn't possibly have the expertise to teach all of this. Hogwarts would need a history department with diverse faculty. The ghost problem is significant, though. Binns died while teaching and apparently didn't even notice, continuing to lecture. He represents stagnation and resistance to change. An international Hogwarts might need to respectfully help Professor Binns move on, perhaps by releasing him from his self-imposed duty to teach. A ceremony recognizing his centuries of service while explicitly relieving him of his obligations might allow him to finally rest, opening the way for a renewed history program that serves all students, not just British ones, ancient runes and arithmancy. The elective courses mentioned in the books would also need international expansion. Ancient runes apparently focuses on runic alphabets used by ancient Germanic and Nordic peoples, but countless writing systems throughout history have had magical significance. Egyptian hieroglyphs are deeply magical in nature. Chinese characters have magical properties and meanings beyond their linguistic function. Sanskrit is a sacred language used in Hindu and Buddhist magical traditions. Arabic calligraphy in Islamic contexts often has magical or spiritual significance. Mesoamerican writing systems from Mayan and Aztec cultures incorporated magical elements. An ancient runes course in an international Hogwarts would need to survey magical writing systems globally, or offer multiple specialized courses in different systems. Arithmancy, the study of magical properties of numbers, might be less culturally variable since mathematics is arguably more universal. But even mathematics has cultural variations in how it's conceptualized and practiced. And numerology, the belief that numbers have inherent magical or mystical significance, definitely varies across cultures. Chinese numerology around lucky and unlucky numbers is well known. Other cultures have their own numerological systems. An international arithmancy class would explore these different approaches while teaching the underlying mathematical principles that govern magical calculations. The entire elective system might need expansion to accommodate diverse interests and career paths relevant to an international student body. Currently, students choose electives in third year from a fairly limited list. An international Hogwarts might offer many more options, some specifically relevant to certain cultural backgrounds or career interests. Classes in magical languages for students who want to pursue international magical careers. Classes in comparative magical law for future magical lawyers or policymakers. Magical anthropology, studying how different magical cultures understand and practice magic. Magical ecology, studying how magical and non-magical ecosystems interact globally. International magical relations, preparing students for diplomatic careers. Magical business and economics for future entrepreneurs. Creative magical arts like magical music, magical visual arts, or magical performance. Magical technology, studying how magic and non-magical technology can be integrated, which is surprisingly relevant given how poorly wizards currently handle any technology. With these additional electives, students could more clearly pursue their interests and prepare for specific careers. British students who never plan to leave Britain might focus on British-focused classes, while students planning international careers would choose globally oriented classes. Students interested in magical creature rights might take magical law, magical creature biology, and magical ethics courses to prepare for advocacy work. Students planning to become cursebreakers working internationally would take ancient runes, arithmancy, defense against the dark arts, and international magical relations to prepare for that career. The standardized one-size-fits-all curriculum currently in place doesn't serve students well. An international Hogwarts would necessarily become more flexible and individualized in its educational approach. The extracurricular opportunities would expand enormously. Currently, Hogwarts has Quidditch, various clubs mentioned peripherally, and not much else officially. An international student body would create demand for many more activities. Sports clubs for various magical sports from different regions. Cultural clubs where students from specific regions or interested in specific cultures can gather, share traditions, celebrate holidays, and support each other. Language exchange clubs where students practice different languages together. Musical groups performing magical music from various traditions. Theater groups putting on plays from different cultures or creating original cross-cultural performances. Art clubs exploring different artistic traditions. Magical cooking clubs where students teach each other traditional recipes. Debate clubs where students discuss international issues. Service clubs organizing charitable activities. Academic competition teams preparing for national or international tournaments. These extracurriculars would be crucial for building community across cultural lines. When students from different backgrounds work together toward common goals in clubs and activities, they form genuine friendships and learn to appreciate each other's perspectives. A British student and a Japanese student might not naturally become friends just from being in classes together, but if they're both in the magical chess club or the choir, spending hours each week pursuing a shared interest, they'll likely form a bond. Hogwarts would need to actively support extracurriculars with funding, faculty advisors, and space to meet. Student life would become much richer and more vibrant than the fairly limited social scene we see in the books, which mostly consists of common room hanging out, Hogsmeade visits, and occasional special events. Let's talk about specific scenarios involving individual students to make this more concrete and human. Imagine a girl named Amara from Nigeria. She's from a prominent magical family in Lagos, and her parents are thrilled but slightly anxious about sending her to Hogwarts. She's excited but also nervous. She arrives at Hogwarts after a portkey journey from a hub in Lagos. Immediately, she notices how cold it is. Scotland in September is much colder than Lagos ever gets. She's wearing the required robes but feels chilled to the bone. At the sorting ceremony, the Hat considers her carefully. She's brave and clever, but what strikes the Hat most is her determination to bridge worlds and bring her culture into this new environment. It places her in Gryffindor for her courage and pioneering spirit. Amara's first few weeks are challenging. She's one of relatively few African students, and she stands out. Her accent is strong, and though she speaks excellent English, British students sometimes struggle to understand her. She misses home intensely, misses the warmth, the food, her family, the familiar magical culture of Lagos. The castle is confusing and cold, and she feels isolated. In classes, she realizes her magical education before Hogwarts was quite different from what British students learned. She practiced wandless magic at home, like most African magical children, and she finds the British obsession with wands limiting. In Charms class, when they're learning Wingardium Leviosa, she lifts the feather without a wand on her first try. Professor Flitwick is amazed and asks her to demonstrate for the class. Some students are impressed, others jealous, others dismissive, saying it's just showing off. Over time, Amara finds her community. She connects with other African students and with students from other regions who also feel like outsiders. She starts an African Student Association that meets weekly to share news from home, cook traditional foods together when they can access the kitchens, and celebrate their cultures. She educates her Gryffindor housemates about Nigeria, correcting their misconceptions and stereotypes. She teaches interested students some wandless magic techniques, becoming a bit of a sensation. By her third year, she's popular and confident, a leader in her year. She plays chaser on the Gryffindor Quidditch team, bringing an aggressive playing style she learned in Lagos, where Quidditch is played faster and rougher than in Britain. She maintains strong ties to home, planning to return to Nigeria after graduation to work in their ministry, bringing her international education back to benefit her home country. Now imagine a boy named Kenji from Tokyo. He attended Mahutokoro, the Japanese magical school, for his first few years and was on track to continue there. But his parents, who work for an international magical corporation, decided the family should relocate to London for work, and they arranged for Kenji to transfer to Hogwarts for his third year. Transferring schools mid-education is always difficult, but crossing international boundaries makes it much harder. Kenji is quiet and reserved, consistent with his cultural background where modesty and not standing out are valued. He's academically excellent, having received rigorous education at Mahutokoro where standards are very high. At Hogwarts, Kenji struggles socially more than academically. He finds British students loud and informal in ways that make him uncomfortable. The house system is foreign to him. Mahutokoro doesn't have an equivalent. He's sorted into Ravenclaw, which makes sense given his academic focus. But he finds the Ravenclaw common room chaotic compared to the orderly environment he's used to. In classes, he's ahead in some subjects and behind in others because the curricula don't align perfectly. He excels at defense against the dark arts because Mahutokoro's program is more advanced. But he struggles in history of magic because he knows nothing about British magical history. And Professor Binns is utterly useless at helping him catch up. Kenji is lonely. He misses his friends from Mahutokoro. He misses Japanese food, Japanese language, the cultural environment where he understood all the unspoken rules. He writes long letters home but feels increasingly disconnected from his old life as his friends there move forward without him. Gradually, though, he finds his place. He discovers that Ravenclaw's Luna Lovegood equivalent in his year is kind to him, not judging him for his quietness or his differences. He joins a study group with other academically serious students. He starts attending a meditation group started by a Buddhist student from Thailand, finding comfort in familiar spiritual practices. He teaches calligraphy and traditional Japanese magic in a cross-cultural exchange program. By his 5th year, he's comfortable, even happy, though he never becomes the most social student. He realizes that his experience navigating between cultures has given him skills and perspectives he wouldn't have gained staying in Japan. He's considering a career in international magical relations, using his cross-cultural experience professionally. Consider a pure-blood British student named Ophelia Greengrass, from an old magical family similar to the Malfoys. She arrives at Hogwarts expecting it to be a bastion of British magical tradition, the way her parents and grandparents described it. Instead, she finds a school full of foreigners who don't respect the traditions she was raised to revere. She's sorted into Slytherin naturally, and she gravitates toward other pure-blood British students who share her discomfort with the changes. For her first few years, she's hostile to international students, making snide comments about their accents, their unfamiliarity with British customs, their different approaches to magic. She complains constantly in letters home, and her parents write to the Board of Governors demanding the school return to British-only admission. But despite herself, Ophelia's worldview is challenged. She's assigned to a group project with Amara, the Nigerian girl from our earlier example, and a boy from India. She tries to do all the work herself, not trusting her foreign partners, but they prove just as capable as she is, maybe more so in some areas. She watches international students excel in classes using techniques she never learned. She overhears conversations about magical history she never knew existed, about non-British magical achievements and civilizations. In her 4th year, a boy from Brazil, charming and clever, shows interest in her. She's attracted to him but conflicted because her family would never approve. They have a secret relationship, and through him, she learns about his culture, his family, his perspectives. It's the first time she's really seen an international student as a complete, complex person rather than just a foreign intruder. By graduation, Ophelia hasn't completely abandoned her family's beliefs, but they've softened significantly. She votes for school policies supporting international students on the student council. She stops making disparaging comments. She considers taking a gap year to travel to magical communities outside Britain, something she never would have imagined as a first year. Her relationship with her family is strained because they see her as having betrayed pure-blood values. But she's become her own person, shaped by 7 years in an environment that challenged everything she was taught. She represents the potential for education to reduce prejudice, though it's a slow and incomplete process. Now imagine a student from a less privileged background, a girl named Rosa from a small magical community in rural Guatemala. She's the first person in her family to attend a major magical school. Her community is isolated, practicing traditional Mayan magical traditions that have been passed down for generations. Rosa is selected for a scholarship program that identifies talented young witches and wizards from underserved magical communities worldwide and funds their Hogwarts education. She's brilliant and hardworking, but she faces enormous challenges. She speaks Spanish and some Mam, a Mayan language, but her English is limited. She's never seen a castle, never used a wand, never encountered most of the magical infrastructure that wealthier students take for granted. Rosa's first year is overwhelming. Everything is new and confusing. She relies heavily on translation charms just to understand classes. She's never eaten British food and finds much of it unpalatable. She's lonely and homesick, missing her family desperately. Financially, everything is a struggle. The scholarship covers tuition and basic supplies, but incidentals like trips to Hogsmeade or replacement equipment when things break are beyond her means. She feels acutely aware of her poverty in ways that sting, especially when wealthy international students casually buy expensive items without thinking. She works part-time in the library to earn a little money, which helps financially but takes time from studying and socializing. But Rosa perseveres. She's motivated by the opportunity this education represents for her and her family. She excels academically despite language barriers, particularly in herbology and potions, where her traditional knowledge of magical plants gives her advantages. She teaches Professor Sprout about Mayan magical plants, sharing knowledge from her grandmother. She finds community with other scholarship students and with students from similar backgrounds who understand the challenges of being first generation at a prestigious school. She starts a support group for students from underserved magical communities, providing peer mentoring and advocacy. By graduation, she's overcome enormous obstacles and she's determined to bring her education back to her community, establishing a school there to ensure other magical children have opportunities she had to fight so hard to access. Consider also a student with disabilities, a boy named Ahmed from Egypt who's deaf. In the Muggle world, being deaf is a significant disability affecting communication and education. In the magical world, it's complicated. Magic offers potential solutions like enchantments that convert sound to visual cues or magical hearing aids. But the magical world's poor track record on accessibility suggests these solutions aren't universally available or used. Ahmed arrives at Hogwarts using magical hearing aids that work imperfectly, and he relies heavily on lip reading and magical captioning when available. He faces immediate challenges. Many spells require verbal components, incantations spoken aloud. How does a deaf student perform verbal magic? Can he learn to cast spells non-verbally, which is typically an advanced technique? Can spells be performed in sign language rather than spoken? Hogwarts staff need to figure out accommodations. They consult with magical educators from Ahmed's school in Egypt, where presumably they have experience with deaf students. They learn that yes, spells can be cast in sign language, with hand movements replacing verbal incantations. The magical intent and understanding are what matter, not the specific verbal sounds. This is revolutionary for understanding how magic works. Ahmed becomes a test case for non-verbal and sign language magic, ultimately demonstrating that magic is more flexible and inclusive than traditional British magical education assumes. His presence pushes Hogwarts to think seriously about accessibility in ways it never has before. Classes start being offered with magical closed captioning. Professors learn to face students when speaking so deaf students can lip read. The understanding of magic itself deepens as educators grapple with how to teach students with different abilities. Let's think about romantic relationships more deeply with specific examples. A British boy and a Japanese girl start dating in their 5th year. They're both in Ravenclaw, they study together constantly, and they develop feelings. But navigating their relationship requires them to communicate about and negotiate different cultural expectations. In British teen culture, relationships involve public displays of affection, holding hands in corridors, kissing. In Japanese culture, especially at their age, public displays of affection are more restrained. The girl is uncomfortable with her boyfriend wanting to hold hands constantly in public, while he feels she's being cold or embarrassed by him. They need to talk explicitly about these cultural differences and find compromises. They learn to respect each other's comfort levels, and in the process, they educate their peers. British students learn that different cultures have different norms around relationships. Japanese students see that it's possible to maintain your cultural values while adapting to a different environment. Or consider a relationship between students whose countries are in conflict in the Muggle world. A Jewish Israeli student and a Palestinian student both attend Hogwarts. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has raged for decades in the Muggle world, and it affects magical communities as well, though perhaps differently. These two students arrive at Hogwarts carrying their community's historical pain, anger, and fear. Initially, they avoid each other, sticking with students from their own backgrounds. But they end up in the same advanced potions class and they're assigned as partners. At first, it's tense. They work together because they have to, barely speaking beyond what's necessary. But over time, working closely together, they start talking. They realize they both love potions. They both have younger siblings they worry about. They both struggle with family expectations. They become friends, tentatively at first, then genuinely. This friendship is controversial. Some students from both communities accuse them of being traitors. They receive angry letters from home, but they persist, believing their friendship is important. They start a dialogue group at Hogwarts for students from conflict regions, creating space to talk about how political conflicts affect them personally and how they can build understanding despite inherited animosities. It's difficult and sometimes painful. Not every conversation goes well, but it's meaningful work. By graduation, they're close friends planning to stay in touch and hoping to work someday on magical peace-building initiatives in their region. Their story is an example of how international education can create connections that transcend conflict, though it's not a simple or easy process. Let's explore what happens during major world events. Suppose there's a major natural disaster in the Muggle world that affects a magical community. An earthquake in Chile damages a major Chilean magical community with many casualties. Several Hogwarts students are from Chile, and they receive devastating news that family members are injured or killed, their homes destroyed. The entire school mobilizes to support them. Students raise funds, collect supplies, and organize a group to travel to Chile during the next break to help with magical rebuilding efforts. This disaster brings the school together in solidarity, with students from every country contributing to help their Chilean classmates and the affected community. It's a demonstration of the international community that Hogwarts has become, where students support each other across national boundaries in times of crisis, or suppose there's a magical conflict in one region that threatens to escalate. A border dispute between two magical governments in Southeast Asia turns violent, with both sides mobilizing magical military forces. Students from both countries are at Hogwarts, and tensions rise in school, mirroring the larger conflict. Students take sides, arguments break out, and there's a real risk of the conflict playing out violently at Hogwarts. School administration needs to intervene carefully, providing mediation, creating spaces for dialogue, ensuring students feel safe regardless of their nationality, and making clear that violence won't be tolerated. This is a test of whether an international school can maintain peace internally when the world outside is in conflict. It's not easy, but with effort, the school manages to keep internal peace and even becomes a model for how conflict can be de-escalated. Through dialogue and mutual understanding, graduation from an international Hogwarts would be profoundly different from the current version. Instead of a primarily British ceremony with some variation in family backgrounds, you'd have families from around the world gathering, some traveling enormous distances, requiring significant magical and financial resources. The ceremony itself would need to reflect global diversity, multiple languages spoken, diverse cultural traditions honored, recognition that students are heading to different futures in different countries with different opportunities and challenges. Speakers might include the headmaster or headmistress, a student representative from the graduating class, and perhaps an international magical leader or distinguished alumnus. Music and performances would represent multiple cultural traditions. Students would wear their robes, but potentially with cultural additions or modifications that reflect their backgrounds. Graduates would leave Hogwarts and scatter across the world. Some return to home countries they haven't lived in for 7 years, needing to readjust to cultures they've been away from during crucial developmental years. Others stay in Britain, pursuing careers or further education. Still others go to third countries, using their international education to access opportunities anywhere in the magical world. Alumni networks would be crucial for these graduates. Regional alumni groups in major magical communities worldwide would help recent graduates with job searching, housing, networking, and navigating adult life in unfamiliar places. International Hogwarts alumni would be a recognizable brand, known for cultural competence, magical versatility, and international perspectives. Major magical employers would actively recruit them, but some graduates would struggle. Those who never fully adjusted to Hogwarts might feel they wasted 7 years being miserable far from home. Those from countries where Hogwarts education isn't recognized might find their degree doesn't translate to job opportunities. Those from disadvantaged backgrounds might return home to communities that don't understand their experiences and where they struggle to apply their elite education to local problems. Not everyone's story would have a happy ending. International education creates winners and losers, and Hogwarts would need to grapple with its responsibilities to all students, not just those who thrive. Over generations, International Hogwarts would create a global magical elite with shared educational background and mutual connections. This could be positive, creating networks for cooperation and mutual understanding. But it could also be problematic, creating class divisions where international Hogwarts graduates form an elite separate from and privileged over those educated in regional schools or in their home communities. The magical world could become more economically unequal, with opportunities concentrated among those with international elite education. Hogwarts would need to be mindful of this, working to maintain accessibility through scholarships and making sure its education serves students rather than just credentialing elites. The physical castle itself would change over decades of international use. Sections would be remodeled to accommodate different needs and preferences. Perhaps a wing is redesigned with aesthetics influenced by Islamic architecture, another with East Asian influences, another with African design elements. The castle would become an architectural hybrid, reflecting its international community. Artwork and portraits would diversify, depicting magical figures from various cultures, not just British magical history. The library would have sections in multiple languages, organized differently to accommodate different research traditions. The Great Hall might have areas where different cultural groups can gather while still maintaining the unified space for whole school events. The castle grounds would be expanded and diversified, with gardens representing different magical horticultural traditions. Hogwarts would become a genuinely cosmopolitan space, not British with international additions but hybrid and complex, belonging to everyone and no one completely. This transformation would be contested. Alumni who attended British-only Hogwarts might mourn what they see as lost tradition. Current British students might feel they don't have full ownership of their own school, but international students would gradually come to feel it's partially their school too, a place they shaped and belonged to. Over time, the international nature of Hogwarts would become its tradition, what it's known for, its identity. Just as current Hogwarts is defined by house system and British magical tradition, future international Hogwarts would be defined by diversity, international exchange, and global magical community. The Hogwarts house system might eventually evolve or be supplemented. Perhaps new houses are added representing different values, or perhaps houses become less important as other forms of community become more prominent. Regional or cultural affinity groups might become as important as houses for student identity. Or maybe houses remain, but their character changes, with each house becoming more internationally diverse and less tied to British cultural values. Slytherin could shed its pure-blood associations entirely, becoming simply the house of ambitious students from any background. Gryffindor could embrace broader understanding of courage that includes different cultural expressions of bravery. Ravenclaw could honor intelligence from diverse epistemological traditions, not just Western academic achievement. Hufflepuff could emphasize community and solidarity across cultural boundaries. The houses would remain but transform, maintaining continuity while adapting to new reality. Let's consider long-term impacts on magical society globally. If Hogwarts successfully becomes international and other schools follow, magical education worldwide becomes more interconnected and mobile. Students might spend different years at different schools, accumulating diverse educational experiences. A student does 1st through 3rd year at their regional school, 4th and 5th at Hogwarts, and 6th and 7th at another international school, creating a truly global magical education. Exchange programs become standard with students spending terms abroad regularly. This creates a generation of magical citizens who think globally, who see themselves as part of an international magical community first and national magical citizens second. This could transform magical politics. International magical organizations like the International Confederation of Wizards become more powerful and more functional. International magical law develops to handle cross-border issues. Magical trade increases as personal connections between magical communities facilitate business relationships. Magical tourism grows as people visit places they heard about from school friends. Languages are learned more commonly as practical tools for maintaining international friendships and business connections. The magical world becomes less divided, more integrated, more cosmopolitan. But nationalism doesn't disappear. Some magical governments and communities resist internationalization, seeing it as threatening their sovereignty and cultural identity. Magical communities might divide between cosmopolitan internationalists and nationalist traditionalists. This division could be more significant than older divisions like blood purity, redefining political alignments in magical society. Elections and political debates might center on questions of international integration versus national autonomy. Some magical communities might close themselves off, refusing to participate in international education and limiting contact with the outside magical world. Others would embrace internationalization fully, opening their borders to magical migration and cultural exchange. The magical world could become more divided even as parts of it become more integrated, with stark differences between cosmopolitan and nationalist magical societies. Dark wizards and witches might exploit these divisions. A charismatic leader could build a movement around magical nationalism, arguing that international integration weakens magical culture and traditional magical values. This could lead to violence against international magical institutions, international students, or cosmopolitan magical communities. Alternatively, a dark wizard might embrace international organization but toward authoritarian ends, trying to establish a global magical dictatorship by gaining control of international magical institutions. The Battle of Hogwarts would pale in comparison to a conflict fought globally among interconnected magical communities. International magical education makes the stakes of magical conflicts higher because the connections are deeper and more widespread. There's also the question of how international magical education affects magical-muggle relations. Currently, magical communities are hidden from muggles, maintaining the international statute of secrecy. But international magical education creates more movement of magical people across borders, more interaction between magical and muggle worlds as magical students and families navigate muggle transportation and bureaucracies. The statute becomes harder to maintain with greater magical mobility and larger international magical institutions. There might be increasing pressure to modify or even end the statute, bringing magical and muggle worlds into open contact. This would be one of the most consequential decisions in magical history, and international magical education could be a factor pushing toward that change by making the current system of total secrecy less practical and less sustainable. Imagine a world where magical and muggle societies are integrated openly, and international magical schools like Hogwarts are known to muggles. Muggle-born students would no longer face the shocking revelation at 11 that magic exists. They'd grow up knowing magic is real, just not something they can do until their powers emerge. Squibs, non-magical children born to magical parents, wouldn't be outcasts, but could move freely between magical and muggle worlds. Intermarriage between magical and non-magical people would be openly recognized and socially acceptable. Technology and magic would integrate, perhaps creating hybrid innovations that use both. This is speculative fiction beyond the original question, but it illustrates how international magical education could be one factor among many that transforms magical society in fundamental and unpredictable ways. Returning to the specific question of Hogwarts, after all this exploration, what's the answer? What if Hogwarts accepted students from other countries? It would be incredibly complex, challenging every aspect of school operations from admissions to academics, to student life, to governance. It would require massive resources, political will, and sustained effort from many parties. Students would face difficulties including culture shock, discrimination, homesickness, and academic challenges. But it would also be deeply enriching, exposing students to diverse perspectives, magical traditions, and cultures that would prepare them for leadership in an interconnected magical world. It would advance international understanding and cooperation in magical society. It would challenge prejudices and expand what's possible in magical education and practice. Whether the benefits outweigh the costs is a value judgment, but the potential for positive transformation is immense. An international Hogwarts wouldn't be perfect, but it could be a powerful force for positive change in the magical world, creating graduates who are more culturally competent, magically versatile, and globally minded than any previous generation of magical people. That would be worth pursuing, despite all the challenges involved. And speaking of the ministry, let's consider their perspective. The British Ministry of Magic has always exerted significant control over Hogwarts. They appoint a board of governors. During Order of the Phoenix, they even installed Dolores Umbridge as a teacher and eventually as headmistress through their educational decrees taking over the school. The ministry sees Hogwarts as a British institution, training the next generation of British witches and wizards who will staff the ministry, run businesses, and uphold British magical society. If Hogwarts goes international, the ministry loses that control. Suddenly, they're just one government among many with an interest in the school. They'd resist this change fiercely, probably requiring legislation in the Wizengamot, the magical high court and parliament. There would be editorials in the Daily Prophet arguing about tradition and the dilution of British magical education. Politicians would campaign on keeping Hogwarts British. It would be a massive political battle. On the other hand, there might be significant diplomatic and economic benefits that could win over some ministry officials. An internationally diverse Hogwarts could become a center of magical diplomacy, with alumni networks spanning the globe. The connections formed between students could lead to better international cooperation in the magical world, which desperately needs it given the insularity and occasional conflicts we see in the books. Economically, international students might pay higher tuition, generating revenue. Though actually, we have no idea if Hogwarts charges tuition. It's never mentioned in the books. Harry's vault pays for his supplies, but school fees are never discussed. Perhaps magical education is state-funded in Britain. If so, that's another complication because surely the British ministry wouldn't fund the education of foreign nationals. International students would have to pay their own way, or their own governments would need to pay Hogwarts, creating a whole financial system that didn't exist before. Let's shift from politics and logistics to something more immediate and personal: language. The most obvious barrier to international integration is that not everyone speaks English. Hogwarts conducts all its classes in English. The textbooks are in English. The ghosts speak Middle English in nearly headless Nick's case or whatever period they're from. The portraits on the walls speak English. Even the Sorting Hat sings in English, complete with rhymes that only work in English. How do you accommodate students who don't speak the language? Magic offers some solutions. Translation charms exist in the Harry Potter universe. During the Quidditch World Cup, we see that wizards from different countries can communicate, presumably through magical translation. The goblet that selected champions for the Triwizard Tournament could evaluate submissions regardless of language. So magical translation is possible. Perhaps every international student receives a translation charm upon arrival, allowing them to understand English as if it were their native language and be understood when they speak their own language. But this has complications. Do they hear the actual English being spoken and their brain translates it, or do they hear their own language as if that's what was said? The former would help them learn English over time. The latter would leave them dependent on magic indefinitely. And what about reading and writing? Does the translation charm work on text? When a Japanese student looks at their Transfiguration textbook, do they see Japanese characters or English words they can somehow understand? If it's automatic translation, what about the nuances of magical language? In our world, learning new concepts often involves learning new vocabulary. If everything is filtered through translation, do students miss out on some of the precise magical terminology? There's also the question of spells themselves. Spells in the Harry Potter universe use Latin or pseudo-Latin incantations. Wingardium Leviosa, Expelliarmus, Avada Kedavra. These aren't English words, so students worldwide would presumably learn the same incantations. But the wand movements, the intent, the feeling behind the magic, these might be taught differently in different magical traditions. A student from Mahutakoro might have learned a completely different approach to levitation before coming to Hogwarts. They might not even use wands, since Ouagadougou in Africa specializes in wandless magic, and it's suggested that other schools might have different focuses too. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of this scenario: the collision of different magical traditions and educational philosophies. Hogwarts teaches wand-based magic with a particular curriculum: transfiguration, charms, potions, defense against the dark arts, herbology, astronomy, and history of magic as core classes, with electives like divination, care of magical creatures, and arithmancy added in third year. But is this the only way to organize magical education? Almost certainly not. We know that Ouagadougou, the African school, emphasizes wandless magic, astronomy, alchemy, and self-transfiguration. Their students would arrive at Hogwarts and possibly find the British obsession with wands to be limited or even primitive. Imagine an 11-year-old from Ouagadougou watching first-year Gryffindors struggle with Wingardium Leviosa, pointing their wands just so, saying the incantation with the right inflection, and this kid just lifts the feather wandlessly because that's what they've been practicing at home since they showed signs of magic. Professor Flitwick's carefully planned lesson suddenly has a student who's doing things a completely different way. Does he accommodate this? Does he insist that all students must learn the wand-based method even if they already know another way? What's the educational philosophy here? Similarly, students from different regions would bring knowledge of different magical creatures, plants, and phenomena. A student from Brazil knows all about creatures from the Amazon that British students have never heard of. A student from Russia has experience with magical creatures adapted to extreme cold. In Care of Magical Creatures class, taught by Hagrid or whoever succeeds him, these students could contribute knowledge that's not in the British textbooks. This could be incredibly enriching, turning classes into genuine exchanges of knowledge rather than one-directional teaching. But it also means professors need to be flexible, willing to admit when a student knows something they don't, and capable of integrating diverse knowledge bases into their curriculum. Not all teachers would handle this well. Can you imagine Snape's reaction to a student correcting him about potion ingredients from their region? Potions is particularly interesting because different magical traditions might use completely different ingredients for the same effects. British potion making relies heavily on European herbs, creatures, and minerals. What if Asian potion making has developed along entirely different lines, using ingredients that produce the same effects through different chemical and magical processes? Students could learn multiple recipes for the same potion. This would actually make students better potioneers, understanding the underlying principles rather than just following recipes by rote. But again, it requires professors who are educated in multiple traditions and open to diverse approaches. Defense against the dark arts would become much more complex and interesting. What's considered a dark art in Britain might be perfectly acceptable magic in another culture, or vice versa. The British magical government has strict laws about unforgivable curses, for instance. But Durmstrang apparently teaches dark arts as part of their curriculum, or at least did historically. Different cultures have different relationships with death, with power, with the boundaries of acceptable magic. A truly international Hogwarts would need to navigate these differences, probably teaching a comparative approach. Here's how British magical law categorizes magic. Here's how other systems categorize it. Here are the ethical frameworks different cultures use to make these distinctions. This is much more sophisticated than the typical defense against the dark arts curriculum, which often amounts to learning defensive spells and fighting dark creatures. History of magic would similarly need a complete overhaul. Currently it's taught by Professor Binns, a ghost who apparently died while teaching and continues lecturing about goblin rebellions in the most boring manner possible. His curriculum is entirely Eurocentric, focused on British and European magical history. An international student body would rightfully demand a more global perspective. What about the magical history of Asia, Africa, the Americas? What about pre-colonial magical societies and how they were affected by European expansion? What about magical conflicts and alliances that happened outside of Europe? The curriculum would need to expand dramatically, and Professor Binns, assuming he's still there as a ghost, would need to either update his approach or be replaced. Given that he's a ghost stuck in his ways who died decades or centuries ago, replacement seems more likely. Even astronomy, which you'd think would be fairly universal since everyone looks at the same sky, would have cultural variations. Different cultures have mapped the stars differently, given them different names, attributed different magical properties to celestial events. Chinese astronomy has a completely different zodiac system than Western astronomy. Indigenous peoples around the world have sophisticated astronomical traditions that magical communities presumably build upon. An international astronomy class could explore how different magical cultures interpret and use the stars, which would be far more interesting than just memorizing the positions of celestial bodies. Let's talk about the social dynamics, because this is where things get really interesting and complicated. Take the house system. Hogwarts' 4 houses, Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, are supposed to sort students by their dominant personality traits: bravery, loyalty, intelligence, and ambition, respectively. This system is deeply embedded in Hogwarts culture. Students identify strongly with their houses. There's inter-house rivalry, especially between Gryffindor and Slytherin. The House Cup is a major event. Quidditch matches are house versus house. Your house becomes your family and your identity. But these particular 4 categories are not universal human values. They're specific to the cultural context in which Hogwarts was founded, reflecting medieval European values of chivalry, feudal loyalty, scholastic learning, and noble ambition. Other cultures might categorize human virtues completely differently. In many Asian cultures, filial piety, harmony, and respect for authority might be considered more important than individual bravery or ambition. In many African cultures, community cohesion and Ubuntu, the philosophy that I am because we are, might be central values that don't map neatly onto the four houses. Indigenous cultures worldwide have their own frameworks for understanding human character and virtue. So what happens when the sorting hat, an artifact created by medieval British wizards, tries to sort students from completely different cultural backgrounds? Does the hat adapt, developing new categories or interpreting its existing categories more flexibly? Or does it force students into British cultural molds, sorting based on how they fit British ideals, rather than how they might be valued in their own cultures? The latter would be a form of cultural imperialism, expecting international students to assimilate into British magical culture rather than bringing their own values and perspectives. The sorting ceremony itself would become a marathon event with an international student body. Currently, sorting about 40 new first years takes maybe 20 minutes. If you're sorting 140 students, a third of whom don't speak English as a first language and might be terrified standing in front of hundreds of strangers in a foreign country, this could take over an hour. Some students might need the sorting hat's decision explained through translation. Others might argue with the hat's choice because they don't understand what Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw represents in British magical culture. The hat might need to conduct entire internal conversations with students in their native languages, explaining the houses and helping them understand where they fit. Imagine a student from a collectivist culture where individual ambition is discouraged being told they belong in Slytherin, the House of Ambition. They might be deeply uncomfortable with this, feeling it contradicts their cultural values. Or a student from a warrior culture being sorted into Hufflepuff might see this as an insult, associating loyalty and kindness with weakness when their culture values martial prowess. The sorting hat would need the wisdom to understand these cultural contexts and either sort students in ways that make sense cross-culturally or provide explanations that help students understand their sorting in a culturally appropriate way. This is asking a lot from an enchanted hat, even a very intelligent one. The dynamics within common rooms would be fascinating and complex. Let's focus on Gryffindor as an example. Traditionally, Gryffindor values bravery, daring, nerve, and chivalry. British students sorted into Gryffindor understand these values through a British cultural lens. Bravery might mean standing up to bullies, trying out for the Quidditch team despite nerves, or sneaking out after curfew for an adventure. But what does bravery mean to a student from a culture with different social norms? For a student from Japan, where social harmony and not standing out are valued, speaking up in class or contradicting a teacher might be an act of tremendous bravery, even though British students do it casually. For a student from a conflict zone, bravery might mean something much more serious and survival-oriented. For a student from an extremely hierarchical society, questioning authority could be the ultimate brave act. The Gryffindor common room would need to expand its understanding of what bravery means, recognizing that courage takes different forms in different contexts. This could lead to really interesting discussions among housemates, where students challenge each other's assumptions and learn to see bravery as a more complex, culturally situated virtue, but it could also lead to conflict. British Gryffindors might see an international student who's quiet and deferential to teachers as not embodying Gryffindor values, not understanding that this student might be incredibly brave in their own cultural context. International students might see British Gryffindors as reckless and disrespectful, breaking rules and challenging authority in ways that seem immature rather than brave. These misunderstandings could create divisions within houses that are supposed to be united families. House unity would require active effort, with students learning about each other's cultures and developing shared house values that transcend any single cultural interpretation. Slytherin would face perhaps the biggest challenges with internationalization. The house has a terrible reputation for blood purity ideology and producing dark wizards. This reputation is specifically tied to British magical history and British pureblood families. International students sorted into Slytherin might be completely confused by this baggage. A student from Brazil sorted into Slytherin for their ambition and cunning would have no connection to British blood purity ideology. They might be ambitious about their career, cunning in their academic strategies, and resourceful in navigating challenges. But none of this has anything to do with whether they think purebloods are superior to Muggleborns. That's a specifically British obsession, so Slytherin would likely split between traditional British pureblood students who cling to the old ideology and international students who are in Slytherin for completely different reasons. This could actually be healthy for the house in the long run. International Slytherins could help reform the house's culture, demonstrating that ambition and cunning are not inherently connected to blood purity or darkness. They could show that you can be ambitious about good things, cunning in ethical ways, resourceful in helping others. Over time, this could redeem Slytherin's reputation, though it would be a struggle. The old guard pureblood families would resist fiercely, seeing international Slytherins as proof that the house is being diluted and corrupted. Imagine the tension in the Slytherin common room. On one side, you have students from families like the Malfoys, Notts, and other British pureblood lines, raised on ideology about blood purity and British magical superiority. On the other side, you have a brilliant student from India who's in Slytherin because of her fierce ambition to become the youngest minister of magic in her country's history. A student from Nigeria whose cunning and strategic thinking got him sorted here. A student from China who's resourceful and determined to master every magical subject. These international students don't care about British blood politics. They're not even really aware of the history. The first time someone makes a comment about mudbloods, they're going to be shocked and offended. Arguments would break out. Some might demand to be resorted. Others might decide to stay and fight to change Slytherin's culture from within. The house elves serving Slytherin would probably be relieved. For centuries, they've served students who often treated them poorly, seeing them as lesser beings. International students from cultures with different attitudes toward service and labor might actually treat the house elves with more respect, confusing and delighting the elves in equal measure. Though this raises the question of whether house elf enslavement is something international parents would accept. Some cultures might have strong objections to their children benefiting from enslaved labor, even if the elves claim to enjoy their work. This could spark a broader movement to reform or end house elf servitude at Hogwarts, with international students and parents applying pressure that British magical society has successfully ignored for centuries. Ravenclaw would probably adapt most easily to international students. The house values intelligence, creativity, learning, and wit. These are fairly universal values, and every culture has its intellectuals and creative thinkers. A Ravenclaw common room with students from around the world would be incredibly stimulating intellectually. Students would share different philosophical traditions, scientific approaches, magical theories, and creative practices. Study groups would become cross-cultural exchanges of knowledge. The riddles required to enter Ravenclaw common room would need to work across languages and cultural contexts, which would make them more interesting and challenging. However, even Ravenclaw would face challenges. Different cultures have different learning styles and different definitions of intelligence. Western education often values individual critical thinking, questioning, and debate. Many Asian education systems emphasize memorization, respect for established knowledge, and building on tradition rather than questioning it. Neither approach is superior. They're different cultural approaches to learning, but they could clash in a shared learning environment. A British Ravenclaw might see an East Asian housemate's approach as uncritical rote learning. The East Asian student might see the British student's approach as disrespectful to accumulated wisdom and lacking in disciplined foundation. Both students are intelligent and value learning, but they're approaching it differently based on their cultural educational backgrounds. Ravenclaw students would need to learn to appreciate different kinds of intelligence and different approaches to learning. The student who can recite entire textbooks from memory is intelligent in a different way than the student who asks unconventional questions challenging the textbook's assumptions. Both are valuable. The house would need to create a culture that celebrates diverse intellectual approaches rather than privileging any single cultural model of what it means to be smart or learned. This would make Ravenclaw richer and more sophisticated, but it would require intentional effort and probably some mediation from the househead when conflicts arose. Hufflepuff might seem like the easiest house for international integration. After all, loyalty, hard work, fair play, and dedication are valued in most cultures, right? Well, sort of. Loyalty is valued everywhere, but loyalty to what varies enormously. In individualistic Western cultures, loyalty might be primarily to friends you choose and principles you believe in. In collectivist cultures, loyalty to family is paramount, even above friendships or personal principles. For some students, family loyalty might conflict with the loyalty to housemates that Hufflepuff expects. What if your housemate does something that would bring shame to your family if you supported them? Different cultures would resolve this conflict differently. Hard work is another value that seems universal but is actually quite culturally specific in how it's understood. In some cultures, Working hard means long hours of individual effort to achieve personal goals. In others, hard work means contributing to collective efforts and community success. Some students might have been raised in cultures where academic achievement is the highest form of hard work. Others come from cultures where practical skills and physical labor are valued equally or more than academic work. Hufflepuff common room conversations about what it means to be hardworking could reveal these deep cultural differences. Fair play and justice, core Hufflepuff values, are interpreted completely differently across cultures. What's fair in one cultural context might seem unjust in another. Restorative justice approaches versus punitive justice, individual rights versus community harmony, equity versus equality. These are complex philosophical questions that different cultures answer differently. Hufflepuff students would grapple with these questions more than any other house, given their house's emphasis on justice and fairness. This could make Hufflepuff the site of the most interesting and challenging moral and ethical discussions in the school, as students from different cultural backgrounds try to figure out what justice means in a multicultural community. Let's talk about specific social scenarios that would play out in an international Hogwarts. Consider the first week of term. British first years arrive nervous but basically understanding what to expect. They've grown up with stories about Hogwarts. Their parents or older siblings went there. They've seen pictures, read books. International first years might arrive with completely different levels of preparation. Some might come from magical families that researched Hogwarts extensively and prepared their children thoroughly. Others might come from isolated magical communities with very little information about British magical culture. They step off the boat or portkey or whatever transportation they used, and everything is alien and overwhelming. The castle itself would be disorienting. International students from modern magical schools with contemporary architecture and conveniences would find Hogwarts primitively medieval. Students from tropical climates would be freezing in the Scottish castle, unprepared for the cold and damp even with warming charms. Students used to different diets would struggle with the food. Students from urban backgrounds might be unnerved by the remote location and the surrounding wilderness. The magical portraits talking and moving would be normal for students from cultures with similar magical art. But students from traditions without this practice might find talking portraits deeply disturbing or even frightening, especially the ones depicting violent scenes or the ghosts floating through walls. The first night in the dormitories would be emotional for many students. Homesickness would hit hard, especially for students from different time zones who are exhausted from travel and temporal displacement. Students who've never been away from family would be crying themselves to sleep in a room full of strangers who speak different languages and have different comfort practices. Some students might have nighttime religious practices or rituals they need to perform. Others might have comfort objects or customs that seem strange to their roommates. British students who are also homesick might nevertheless feel less displaced because at least the culture is familiar. Friendships in the first few weeks would likely form along linguistic lines initially. Students who share a language would gravitate together, needing the comfort of easy communication in a confusing environment. You'd see clusters of Spanish speakers, Mandarin speakers, Arabic speakers, French speakers, and so on during free time. This is natural and healthy to some extent. Students need safe spaces with people who share their background, but if these clusters became permanent and exclusive, the school would fail at integration. So Hogwarts would need structures to encourage cross-cultural friendship formation, assign study partners from different countries, collaborative projects requiring diverse teams, extracurricular activities that attract students with shared interests regardless of background. The process of making friends across cultural divides is complex. It starts with curiosity and tentative interaction. Maybe a British student and a Japanese student are assigned as partners in herbology. They're both a little nervous and unsure how to communicate effectively. They start with the task at hand, repotting a mandrake or whatever. Through working together, they discover they both love magical creatures. They start talking more, discovering shared interests. The British student is fascinated by Japanese magical creature lore. The Japanese student is curious about British wizarding traditions. They start spending time together outside class. They teach each other slang and swear words in their languages, which is what teenagers do. They laugh at each other's jokes even when they don't fully understand them. Over months and years, they become genuine friends, learning each other's cultures and languages, visiting each other's homes during summers, becoming bridges between their communities. But not every cross-cultural interaction goes this well. Misunderstandings and conflicts are inevitable. A British student might invite an international friend to hang out and interpret their refusal as rudeness, not understanding that in the friend's culture, you're supposed to refuse invitations twice before accepting to show you're not imposing. An international student might stand very close during conversations, which is normal in their culture, making British students uncomfortable because they value more personal space. Someone might make a gesture they think is friendly but is actually offensive in another culture. These microaggressions and misunderstandings can damage relationships before they really begin. The school would need mandatory cultural competency education, probably during the first year, teaching students about different cultural norms around communication, personal space directness versus indirectness, eye contact, time orientation, and hundreds of other subtle factors that affect interaction. This wouldn't prevent all misunderstandings, but it would give students a framework for recognizing when something that seems rude or strange might actually be a cultural difference rather than personal hostility. Students would learn to ask questions rather than make assumptions, to clarify intentions rather than taking offense, to approach differences with curiosity rather than judgment. Even with education, some students would struggle more than others with cultural adaptation. Personality matters enormously. An outgoing, flexible, curious student from any culture would adapt more easily than a shy, anxious, rigid student. Some students thrive on new experiences and diversity. Others find it overwhelming and stressful. Hogwarts would need to recognize that students have different adaptation speeds and different needs for support. Some international students would jump into British wizarding culture enthusiastically, trying every food, joining every club, making friends across all boundaries. Others would cling to their cultural comfort zones, socializing primarily with students from similar backgrounds, maintaining their home culture practices as much as possible, counting down the days until they could go home. Neither approach is wrong, and students might move between these extremes at different points during their 7 years. First year might be about survival and finding any source of comfort and familiarity. Second and third years might be about cautious exploration and expanding social circles. Fourth and fifth years, with the stress of OWLs, might be about retreating to comfortable friend groups. Sixth and seventh years might be about consolidating friendships and preparing for life after Hogwarts. The journey of cultural adaptation is not linear. It's full of advances and retreats, enthusiasm and homesickness, connection and isolation. Let's think about holiday periods because these would be emotionally complex for international students. Christmas at Hogwarts is a big deal in the books. The castle is decorated, there's a feast, students exchange gifts. But Christmas is a Christian holiday, and many international students wouldn't celebrate it. They'd be at school during a holiday that means nothing to them personally, watching their Christian classmates celebrate, possibly feeling excluded and lonely. Yes, Hogwarts would presumably also celebrate other holidays, but you can't celebrate every holiday from every culture. The school calendar has to prioritize some holidays over others, and that prioritization itself is a political statement about which cultures are centered. International students who can't or don't want to go home for Christmas would need alternative programming during the break. Maybe Hogwarts organizes special activities for students staying over holidays, trips to magical sites in Britain and Europe, special workshops, cultural exchange events where students share their own holiday traditions. This could be really special, actually. Students from different backgrounds teaching each other about their celebrations, creating new hybrid traditions, building community among the international students who stay. It could be lonely, or it could be bonding, depending on how the school handles it. Summer holidays would be the real test of integration. British students go home to magical Britain, staying connected to magical culture. International students go home to their countries and might experience reverse culture shock. After 9 or 10 months at Hogwarts, they've adapted somewhat to British culture and the international school environment. Then they go home and everything that used to be normal feels slightly off. Their family and old friends haven't changed, but they have. They've experienced things and met people their families can't fully understand. They might feel like they don't fully belong anywhere anymore. Not British, but not quite the same as their non-Hogwarts countrymen either. This is a real phenomenon called third culture kid syndrome, and it can be psychologically challenging. Some students would relish this in-between identity, feeling like citizens of the world rather than any one nation. They'd maintain friendships with Hogwarts classmates over the summer through owlpost or magical communication, counting down the days until they could return to school where they felt they truly belonged. Other students would find it painful, feeling displaced and rootless. They might struggle with their identity, wondering if attending Hogwarts was worth losing their clear sense of cultural belonging. The school's counseling services would need to support students through these identity challenges, helping them integrate their multiple cultural identities in healthy ways. Romantic relationships in an international Hogwarts would be wonderfully complex. Teenage romance is already confusing and dramatic. Add cultural differences, language barriers, and families thousands of miles away with strong opinions about acceptable partners, and you've got a recipe for both beautiful love stories and painful complications. Let's imagine some specific scenarios. A British boy and a girl from India start dating in their 5th year. They're both in Ravenclaw, they've been friends for years, and romantic feelings develop. But her family, when they find out, is horrified. They're from a traditional Hindu family and expect her to have an arranged marriage within their community. The idea of her dating casually, especially someone not Indian and not Hindu, is completely unacceptable. They send her howlers, they threaten to withdraw her from school, they pressure her to end the relationship. She's torn between her family's expectations and her own desires. Her boyfriend doesn't really understand the depth of the cultural conflict, because in British culture, teenagers dating is normal, and parents generally accept their children's choices. This relationship could end badly, with her choosing family over romance and both teenagers getting hurt. Or it could be a story of her negotiating with her family, educating her boyfriend about her culture, and finding a middle path. Either way, it's complicated. Or consider a romance between two international students from countries that are politically hostile to each other in the Muggle world. Maybe a student from Pakistan and a student from India, or a student from Israel and a student from Palestine. These students meet at Hogwarts with no political baggage of their own. They're 11 years old when they arrive, they become friends, and eventually romantic feelings develop. But the weight of historical and political conflict that has nothing to do with them personally hangs over their relationship. Their families might be horrified, seeing the relationship as a betrayal. Their communities back home might view them as traitors for loving someone from the enemy nation. They'd face pressure from multiple directions to end the relationship and choose their national identity over their personal feelings. This scenario could go several ways. The couple might decide their love transcends political boundaries, continuing the relationship despite opposition and becoming symbols of peace and reconciliation. That's the romantic, optimistic outcome. More realistically, the pressure might be too much. They might break up despite loving each other, crushed by the weight of conflicts older and bigger than themselves. Or they might hide the relationship, which creates its own stress and pain. These are real dilemmas that students in international schools face, and an international Hogwarts would need to support students navigating these impossible situations. Same-sex relationships would add another layer of complexity. Different cultures have vastly different attitudes toward homosexuality and LGBTQ+ identities. British magical culture, as depicted in the books, seems to largely ignore the topic, though presumably gay and lesbian witches and wizards exist, and some are more or less accepted. But an international student body would include students from cultures where homosexuality is celebrated, cultures where it's tolerated, and cultures where it's criminalized and deeply stigmatized. A student from a conservative culture who realizes they're gay while at Hogwarts faces an incredibly difficult situation. They might find acceptance from international friends whose cultures are more open, but they'd have to hide their identity from students from their own country, and especially from their family. The fear of being outed to family could be paralyzing. Hogwarts would need to be a safe space where all students can explore their identities without fear. This means explicit anti-discrimination policies, support groups, education about diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, and protection from families who might react violently to their children coming out. This is a radical ask for magical Britain, which doesn't seem particularly progressive on these issues based on the books. But taking on international students means accepting responsibility for their safety and well-being, even when that conflicts with the values of their home cultures. This would be controversial and politically difficult, but necessary. Then there are relationships that work beautifully, where cultural differences enrich the romance rather than complicating it. A French student and a Brazilian student bond over their shared love of dance and music, teaching each other their cultural dances, creating fusion performances for school events, falling in love through shared artistic expression. A Nigerian student and a Japanese student find unexpected compatibility, Despite or because of their very different cultural backgrounds, learning each other's languages, sharing their family traditions, planning a future together that bridges their worlds. These relationships would be strengthened by working through cultural differences, with both partners growing and expanding their worldviews through loving someone from another culture. The public nature of teenage relationships at a boarding school would make everything more intense. You can't hide a relationship at Hogwarts. Everyone sees who's sitting together at meals, who's holding hands in corridors, who's sneaking off to broom cupboards. For students from cultures where public displays of affection are completely unacceptable, this would be mortifying. They might want to date someone but feel unable to do so publicly, leading to secret relationships and lots of stress. For students from more open cultures, watching their British or international peers police other people's relationships might seem absurd and repressive. These different norms would create constant friction and negotiation about what's acceptable in shared spaces. School dances would be fascinating cultural battlegrounds. The Yule Ball and Goblet of Fire was already complicated enough with just British students and 2 visiting schools. Imagine organizing a dance for a fully international student body. What music do you play? British pop would be familiar to British students and probably some international students who follow Western media, but meaningless to others. Do you play music from different cultures, creating a multicultural dance experience? That's inclusive, but it also means people are constantly hearing music they don't know and can't dance to. Do you teach everyone line dances or group dances from various cultures? That's a nice idea, but requires lots of preparation, and not everyone will want to participate in structured dancing. And what about dance styles themselves? Different cultures have completely different norms about how men and women dance together. Ballroom dancing, common in British formal dances, involves close physical contact and specific partner holds. Some cultures would find this inappropriately intimate. Other cultures have dance styles that are much more physically expressive and might make British students uncomfortable. Grinding, popular in some Western dance cultures, would be completely scandalous to students from conservative cultures. The school would probably need to establish ground rules about acceptable dancing while also being flexible enough to accommodate diverse styles. This is a delicate balance. Fashion at school dances would be incredible, though. Students would wear formal wear from their cultures, turning the Great Hall into a showcase of global fashion. British students in traditional dress robes alongside students in saris, kimonos, hanbok, dashikis, barong Tagalogs, and formal wear from every culture represented. The visual diversity would be stunning, and students would get to see and appreciate beautiful clothing traditions from around the world. This would be one of the purely positive aspects of an international Hogwarts, the beauty and richness of seeing so many cultures represented. Let's talk about academic competition and the intensity that might bring. Different educational cultures have very different attitudes toward academic achievement and competition. In some cultures, particularly in East Asia, academic achievement is incredibly important, with intense pressure from family and society to excel. Students from these cultures might arrive at Hogwarts with extremely strong work ethics, spending every free moment studying, striving for perfect marks, seeing anything less than outstanding as failure. British students, generally coming from a more relaxed educational culture where balance and extracurriculars are also valued, might initially be caught off guard by this intensity. This could raise the overall academic standard at Hogwarts. British students who thought they were working hard might realize they've been coasting compared to some of their international peers. This could be motivating, pushing everyone to achieve more. But it could also create an unhealthy competitive atmosphere, with students stressed and burning out trying to keep up with impossible standards. The students most affected would probably be those caught in the middle, not naturally brilliant enough to excel without effort, not from cultures that prepared them for intense academic competition, but ambitious enough to want to succeed. These students could end up anxious, depressed, and feeling like failures despite being perfectly competent. Hogwarts professors would need to actively work against cutthroat competition and foster collaborative learning instead. Maybe they restructure classes to include more group work where students must help each other succeed. Maybe they evaluate on growth and effort as well as absolute achievement. Maybe they explicitly teach that education is not a zero-sum competition where someone else's success means your failure. This would be countercultural for students from hyper-competitive educational backgrounds, but it might also be a relief. Students who've been under crushing pressure their whole lives might discover at Hogwarts that learning can be joyful and collaborative rather than a constant stressful competition. Cheating would become a more complex ethical issue. Different cultures have different norms about academic integrity. In some cultures, helping a friend with homework or sharing answers is seen as loyalty and kindness, not cheating. The Western concept of individual achievement and original work is not universal. Some cultures emphasize collective achievement and see sharing knowledge as appropriate and generous. Students from these backgrounds might collaborate on assignments in ways that British professors would consider cheating, not out of dishonesty, but out of genuinely different cultural understanding of what's appropriate academic behavior. Hogwarts would need to be very explicit about its academic integrity policies, explaining not just what the rules are, but why they exist and what values they're based on. This could actually lead to interesting philosophical discussions. Why does Western education value individual work so highly? What's lost and gained by emphasizing individual achievement versus collective learning? Are there contexts where collaboration should be encouraged rather than forbidden? Students might challenge the traditional rules, and Hogwarts might actually evolve to have more nuanced policies that recognize different cultural values while still maintaining standards. Language learning would become both necessary and highly valued. British students would have opportunities to learn languages from classmates that they'd never have access to otherwise. Imagine being able to learn Mandarin from native speakers your own age, or Arabic or Swahili or Japanese. These aren't just language lessons from a book. They're living language immersion. Students would pick up slang, idioms, jokes, swear words, all the things that make you actually functional in a language rather than just textbook proficient. By 7th year, many students would be conversationally fluent in multiple languages, which is an incredible skill for their future careers and lives. Some students would have a real gift for languages and thrive in this environment. Collecting languages like other people collect chocolate frog cards. They'd be the translators and cultural mediators, helping their less linguistically talented friends communicate and navigate cultural differences. These students would be invaluable to the school community and would develop skills that would serve them well in any international magical career. Other students would struggle with languages, never really getting beyond basic pleasantries in anything other than English and their native language. That's okay too. Not everyone has to be a polyglot, but everyone would gain at least some multilingual competence, understanding how languages work even if they never become fluent in multiple languages. The existence of translation charms would be both helpful and potentially problematic for language learning. If you can understand everyone through magical translation, what's the incentive to actually learn their language? This is like how GPS makes people worse at navigation. Magical translation might make students lazy about language learning. Hogwarts would probably need to restrict translation charm use in certain contexts, creating language learning zones where students must use their non-magical linguistic skills. Maybe certain classes are taught without translation charms available, forcing students to actually learn enough English to function. Maybe social events encourage natural, multilingual interaction rather than magic-mediated communication. The goal would be using magic as a tool for communication when necessary while still encouraging genuine language acquisition. Let's dive deep into specific classes and how they'd change with international students. Potions would be fascinating. Professor Snape, if he were still teaching, would have an absolute nightmare trying to maintain control of a class where half the students don't respond to his intimidation tactics the way British students do. His sarcasm and cruelty might not even translate effectively. Students from cultures where shaming is not an acceptable teaching method might report him to their embassies. His favoritism toward Slytherin would be complicated by the fact that Slytherin would be full of international students who he can't connect to through pure-blood British culture. Snape would either need to radically change his teaching approach or be removed, and honestly, removal seems more likely. A more competent and culturally sensitive potions professor would transform the class into something really special. They'd teach multiple potion-making traditions, showing how different magical cultures achieve similar effects through different ingredients and processes. A healing potion might have a European version using European herbs, an Asian version using different plants and preparation methods, an African version that incorporates different magical principles entirely. Students would learn that there are multiple right answers, multiple paths to the same magical outcome. This is more sophisticated understanding of magic than the typical British follow this recipe exactly approach. Advanced potion students might do independent research projects exploring how to substitute ingredients from their home regions into British potion recipes or vice versa. A student from South America might investigate whether Amazonian magical plants could replace European ingredients in common potions, potentially discovering improved formulas or new potions entirely. This is real magical innovation, cross-cultural pollination of magical knowledge creating new possibilities. The best projects could be published in international potions journals, bringing prestige to Hogwarts and the student researchers. This is education at its best. Students not just learning established knowledge but contributing new knowledge to their field. Transfiguration with an international student body would need to address different magical traditions around changing forms. We know from the books that human transfiguration is advanced and regulated magic. But some magical traditions, like the African animagus tradition suggested by Ouagadougou's emphasis on self-transfiguration, approach body transformation very differently. A professor teaching international students would need to be knowledgeable about these different traditions and able to incorporate them into the curriculum. Maybe British students learn the traditional European approach, while students from other backgrounds share their traditions. And everyone gains a more complete understanding of transformation magic. The ethical dimensions of transfiguration would be another area where cultural differences emerge. Different cultures have different beliefs about the relationship between form and essence, whether changing an object's form changes its essential nature, whether there are moral limits on transformation. These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They affect how wizards approach transfiguration magic. A class discussion about the ethics of human transfiguration, for instance, would reveal widely varying viewpoints based on different cultural and religious frameworks. This would make the class more intellectually challenging and rewarding, as students grapple with complex ethical questions without easy universal answers. Charms class would probably be the most universally accessible subject because charms are practical magic that every culture needs, making objects levitate, unlocking doors, lighting wands. These are useful abilities regardless of your cultural background. But even in charms, there would be cultural variations. Different magical cultures might use different incantations for the same effects, or no incantations at all in wandless traditions. Professor Flitwick, if he's still teaching, would need to be flexible about accepting different approaches as long as they achieve the desired result. A student who can levitate an object wandlessly should get full credit even if they didn't cast Wingardium Leviosa the traditional way. The social, collaborative nature of many charms would be great for integration. Partner work in charms class forces students to work together, communicate despite language barriers, help each other succeed. You can't really levitate something for your partner. You have to teach them how to do it themselves. This creates natural mentoring relationships and friendships based on mutual aid. Some of the strongest cross-cultural friendships at Hogwarts would probably form in charms class through this collaborative learning process. Defense against the dark arts would be the most controversial class by far. What constitutes dark magic is hugely culturally variable. British magical law categorizes certain spells as unforgivable curses, Avada Kedavra, Crucio, Imperio. Use of these spells on humans carries an automatic life sentence in Azkaban. But other magical cultures might have different definitions of unforgivable magic. Some might consider the Imperious Curse acceptable in certain contexts, like law enforcement or medical treatment of mentally ill magical people. Others might have entirely different categories of forbidden magic based on their own ethical and religious frameworks. A good defense against the dark arts professor teaching international students would need to take a comparative approach. Here's how British law categorizes magic. Here's how other nations categorize it. Here are the different ethical frameworks cultures use to distinguish acceptable from unacceptable magic. The goal wouldn't be moral relativism, claiming all approaches are equally valid, but rather critical thinking about why different societies draw lines differently and what values underlie these distinctions. Students would have to think about their own ethical beliefs and defend them with reasoning rather than just accepting the laws of their birth culture as natural and correct. This approach would be uncomfortable for everyone at times. British students would have to defend why their culture considers certain magic dark while accepting other violent magic as legitimate. International students would have to examine whether their own culture's magical ethics make sense or are just traditional practices they've never questioned. Some students and parents would object to this kind of relativistic teaching, wanting their children taught that their culture's approach is right and others are wrong. But education at its best makes students uncomfortable sometimes. Challenging them to think, rather than just accept. The practical defense against the dark arts components would be fascinating with international students. Different cultures have different defensive and offensive magical traditions. Students would share techniques from their backgrounds, creating a much richer tactical education. A student from a culture with strong dueling traditions could teach advanced dueling techniques. A student from a culture emphasizing defensive and protective magic could teach powerful shielding spells unknown in Britain. Students from regions with different dangerous creatures could share knowledge about defending against threats British students have never encountered. By graduation, students would be much more comprehensively prepared for magical defense than if they'd only learned British techniques. History of magic desperately needs reform, even in a purely British Hogwarts. But with international students, it becomes absolutely necessary. Professor Binns' endless lectures about medieval goblin rebellions would be mind-numbingly irrelevant to students from other continents. An international Hogwarts would need a complete curriculum overhaul, teaching global magical history from multiple perspectives. This is a massive undertaking, requiring new textbooks, new lesson plans, and professors who actually know global magical history, rather than just European events. The challenges of teaching global history are significant. Whose version of events do you teach when different cultures have conflicting historical narratives? How do you address colonialism and the harm European magical communities did to indigenous magical peoples worldwide? How do you teach about magical wars and conflicts where students in the class might be from opposing sides? These are not easy questions, but they're necessary to address. An international Hogwarts can't just ignore the difficult parts of magical history because they're uncomfortable. The best approach might be teaching history thematically rather than chronologically. One unit might focus on how different magical cultures responded to witch hunts and persecution by non-magical people. Another might examine magical governments and political systems across cultures. Another might explore the history of magical-muggle relations in different societies. This thematic approach allows for comparison and analysis, rather than just memorizing dates and events. Students would develop historical thinking skills, learning to analyze sources, recognize bias, understand causation, and construct arguments based on evidence. This is much more valuable than memorizing facts about goblin rebellions, student-led. Learning could be really effective for history of magic. Each student or small group could become the class experts on their home region's magical history, researching and presenting to classmates. This distributes the knowledge burden while empowering students to teach each other. A student from Egypt becomes the class expert on ancient Egyptian magical practices. A student from Peru teaches about Incan magical traditions. A student from Mongolia shares the magical history of Central Asian nomadic peoples. These presentations would be much more engaging than Professor Binns' lectures, and students would retain information better when learning from passionate peers rather than a droning ghost. Care of magical creatures under Hagrid or a successor would be transformed by international students bringing knowledge of creatures from their home regions. The textbook, Monster Book of Monsters or whatever they're using, would need massive expansion to include creatures from all continents. Class field trips might even include international travel through Port Key to observe creatures in their native habitats. Imagine taking students to the Amazon to study Brazilian magical creatures, or to African savannas to observe creatures that exist nowhere else, or to Asian mountains to find creatures from Chinese magical tradition. This would be incredibly enriching, though logistically complex and expensive. The ethical treatment of magical creatures would be another area where cultural differences emerge. Different cultures have different relationships with animals and different beliefs about animal rights and human dominion over nature. Some students might come from cultures that see certain creatures as sacred and be horrified by how Hogwarts treats them. Others might come from cultures with more utilitarian views of animals and think British students are too sentimental. Discussions about whether it's ethical to keep dragons captive, or breed hippogriffs for human use, or harvest unicorn hair would reveal these different philosophical frameworks. Again, this makes the class intellectually richer and more challenging. Herbology would similarly benefit from international knowledge. Professor Sprout or whoever teaches it would learn about magical plants from every climate and ecosystem on Earth. The Hogwarts greenhouses would need expansion to create appropriate environments for tropical plants, desert plants, Arctic plants, and everything in between. Students would contribute cuttings or seeds from magical plants native to their regions. building Hogwarts botanical collection. The most advanced students might do breeding experiments, crossing plants from different regions to create new hybrid species with combined properties. This kind of practical magical botany would produce real contributions to magical agriculture and potioneering. Astronomy is interesting because you'd think the stars are the same for everyone, but different cultures have mapped and interpreted the heavens completely differently. British magical astronomy is based on Western astrological traditions with Greek and Roman constellation names, but Chinese astronomy has completely different constellations and astrological interpretations. Indigenous cultures worldwide have their own sophisticated astronomical traditions. An international astronomy class would need to acknowledge these different systems and possibly teach multiple astronomical frameworks. This is more complex than the current Hogwarts astronomy curriculum, but also more intellectually honest, recognizing that the Western interpretation of the night sky is not the only valid one. The practical observations required for astronomy class would be challenging for students from different time zones. If they're keeping their home circadian rhythms using time magic, midnight in Scotland might be mid-afternoon for them biologically. They'd be expected to stay up observing stars when their body is telling them it should be broad daylight. This is a recipe for exhausted students. Hogwarts would probably need to excuse international students from some midnight observations or find alternative ways for them to complete the requirements. Maybe magical recordings of the night sky they can observe at times that work for their bodies. Divination is culturally fascinating because every culture has divinatory practices, but they vary enormously. British magical divination focuses on tea leaves, crystal balls, dream interpretation, astrology. But other cultures read bones, shells, cards, smoke patterns, animal behavior, or use completely different methods. Trelawney, if she's still teaching, would be completely out of her depth with students bringing knowledge of divination systems she's never heard of. A more competent divination professor would teach comparative divination, exploring different cultural systems and their theoretical foundations. This would make the class more legitimate and intellectually respectable, which divination desperately needs. Arithmancy and ancient runes would face interesting challenges. These are elective subjects that seem to be based on European magical traditions. Arithmancy uses number magic, which exists in some form in most cultures, but with different numerological systems and meanings. Ancient runes studies magical writing systems, but which runes? Currently, it seems to focus on Germanic runes, but magical writing systems exist in many cultures. Egyptian hieroglyphs have magical properties. Chinese characters have magical significance. The course would need to expand dramatically to be truly international, becoming a general study of magical languages and symbol systems, rather than just ancient Germanic runes. Muggle studies would be absolutely transformed by international students. Currently, it's apparently British wizards learning about British Muggle life, which they should already know since they live surrounded by Muggles. An international Muggle studies class would explore how Muggle societies differ across the world, and how magical communities in different regions interact with their local Muggle populations. This is genuinely interesting and useful information for students who will live in an interconnected world where understanding both magical and Muggle global affairs matters. The class might even help students understand their international classmates better, learning about the Muggle cultures their classmates come from. Let's talk about Quidditch in depth because this is where international diversity would be most visible and exciting. Quidditch is hugely important to Hogwarts culture, and sports are often the place where international competitions are most intense and meaningful. Currently, Hogwarts Quidditch is organized by house teams. 4 teams, each representing a house, compete throughout the year for the Quidditch Cup. This system creates house loyalty and exciting competition. But with an international student body, this system might not work as well. International students might feel less loyalty to houses they don't fully understand and more loyalty to their national identities. One option is to maintain the house system but actively recruit international students onto house teams, creating truly diverse squads. Each house team would have players from multiple countries bringing different playing styles and strategies. This would actually improve the quality of Quidditch at Hogwarts. Students who grew up playing in different national styles would teach each other techniques, creating hybrid styles that combine the best of multiple traditions. The aggressive Bulgarian seeking style, the precision Irish chaser formations, the innovative Japanese beater strategies, all mixing together on the same teams. Another option is to create an international Quidditch league separate from or alongside the house competition. National teams or regional teams composed of students from specific areas compete against each other. This would be incredibly exciting, turning Hogwarts into a miniature Quidditch World Cup every year. Students would pack the stands cheering for their national teams, creating an electric atmosphere. The competition would be fierce, with national pride on the line. This could be healthy competition that channels national loyalty into sports rather than conflict. Or it could reinforce national divisions and create animosity when countries that are already politically tense face off on the Quidditch pitch. Probably the best system would be a combination: house Quidditch for school unity and identity, and an international tournament once or twice a year for national representation. This gives students both experiences, competing for their house alongside students from different countries and competing for their country alongside fellow nationals. The logistics would be complex, with team practices, match schedules, and field time allocation becoming a complicated puzzle. But the payoff would be a rich, diverse sports culture that accommodates multiple loyalties and identities. The introduction of other magical sports besides Quidditch would be genuinely exciting. We know from the books that Quidditch is the dominant but not only magical sport. Different magical cultures must have their own sports, games, and competitions. An international Hogwarts could introduce some of these, giving students more options and exposing British students to sports they've never encountered. Imagine a magical sport from Africa that combines elements of soccer and magic, played on a massive field with teams of 20 working together to score goals using levitated balls and defensive spells. Or a Japanese magical martial art that's part sport, part combat training, teaching discipline, respect, and magical fighting techniques. Or a Brazilian game played in water using aquatic magic and swimming skills. These sports would need facilities, equipment, and knowledgeable coaches. The investment would be significant but worthwhile. Students who don't like Quidditch or aren't athletic in ways Quidditch rewards would have other options for physical activity and competition. Students could discover sports from other cultures they love and become passionate about. International students could share their cultures through sport, which is often more accessible than academic or linguistic cultural exchange. And the variety would make Hogwarts' athletic program more robust and inclusive, accommodating different kinds of athletes and different definitions of what makes a good athlete. The logistics of managing multiple sports with an international student body would be nightmarish for whoever coordinates athletics. Field time allocation, equipment procurement, coach hiring, match scheduling, injury management, all complicated by having multiple sports with different requirements and safety protocols. You'd need a dedicated athletics department with multiple staff members just to keep everything organized. But magical schools should promote physical fitness and healthy competition, so the investment would be justified. Intramural and recreational sports would also flourish. Not everyone wants to compete at a high level. Some students just want to play for fun. Hogwarts could offer recreational leagues in various sports where students play for enjoyment rather than glory. These leagues would be great for integration because they're lower pressure, more social, and more accessible to students of varying skill levels. A pickup Quidditch game with mixed nationality teams, everyone laughing and having fun without worrying about winning, builds friendships and community in ways formal competition sometimes doesn't. Student clubs and organizations would proliferate in an international Hogwarts. We see some clubs in the books like the Gobstones Club and the Dueling Club, but an international student body would create demand for many more. Cultural clubs would form where students from specific regions or countries gather to maintain connection to their home cultures. A South Asian Students Association, an African Students Union, a Latin American club, an East Asian Society. These organizations would celebrate their cultures through events, food, performances, and education, sharing their traditions with the wider school community. Language clubs would be popular, with students gathering to practice languages they're learning. A Spanish conversation table meets weekly for anyone learning Spanish to practice in a low-pressure environment. A Mandarin study group helps students tackle one of the most challenging languages to learn. A multilingual debate club conducts debates in various languages, challenging advanced language learners and helping everyone develop skills in argumentation across linguistic barriers. These clubs would be valuable for language acquisition and also for building international friendships. Based on shared interests in language and culture, religious and spiritual organizations would be necessary for students from diverse faith traditions. A Muslim Students Association would need space for prayer 5 times daily and support during Ramadan when students are fasting. A Hindu student organization might organize celebrations for Diwali and other festivals. A Jewish students group would need accommodations for Shabbat and kosher food options. A Christian fellowship would serve the various Christian denominations represented in the student body. A Buddhist meditation group would offer practice and teaching for interested students. The school would need to provide space for these organizations and respect their practices, which is a significant logistical and administrative undertaking but necessary for supporting students' spiritual lives. There would also be affinity groups based on shared experiences rather than national or religious identity. A third culture kids group for students who feel between cultures. An LGBTQ+ alliance for students exploring sexual orientation and gender identity. A first-generation magical students group for students from non-magical families navigating the wizarding world. A Students of Color organization addressing the specific challenges faced by racial minorities in a predominantly white British institution. These groups would provide crucial support and community for students dealing with particular challenges and identities. Academic clubs would thrive with diverse international membership. The Potions Club would have members sharing techniques and ingredients from different traditions, conducting experiments, and entering international competitions. The Charm Society would work on advanced charm work and theoretical charm mechanics. A magical theory study group would tackle complex theoretical questions about the nature of magic itself. A spell invention club would work on creating new spells, combining insights from different magical traditions. These clubs would be spaces where the most academically motivated students push beyond the standard curriculum, and international diversity would make them more innovative and creative. Performance arts would be enriched by international students bringing diverse artistic traditions. A school choir would sing songs in dozens of languages, performing pieces from various musical traditions. A theater troupe would stage plays from world literature, not just British works. A dance company would incorporate dance styles from around the world, creating fusion pieces that blend traditions. An orchestra would play both Western classical music and musical traditions from other cultures, introducing audiences to diverse sounds and instruments. These performances would be highlights of the school year, showcasing the artistic richness that diversity brings. Visual arts clubs would similarly benefit. A photography club capturing images of daily life in an international school would create powerful documentation of cross-cultural interaction. A painting and drawing club would see students working in different artistic traditions, learning from each other's techniques and perspectives. A magical arts club would explore specifically magical forms of art, like moving paintings and sculptures, combining artistic traditions with magic in innovative ways. Student art exhibitions would be visually stunning, showing the incredible creativity that emerges when diverse artists work alongside each other. Service and activism clubs would attract students who want to make the world better. A human rights club might work on issues affecting both magical and non-magical people worldwide. An environmental action group would address ecological challenges, possibly partnering with magical and non-magical environmental organizations. A peace and reconciliation club would work on conflict resolution and bringing together students from countries in conflict. A charity and volunteer group would organize fundraising and service projects to help disadvantaged magical and non-magical communities globally. These clubs would give students ways to channel their idealism and energy into positive action. Let's imagine some specific scenarios of cultural conflict and how they might play out in an international Hogwarts. Scenario 1. A student from a culture where academic cheating is seen as helping friends collaborates extensively with classmates on an assignment meant to be individual work. The professor catches this and accuses the student of cheating. The student is confused and hurt, feeling they were being a good friend and helpful classmate. The professor is angry, seeing clear violation of academic integrity rules. How does this get resolved? Ideally, there's a conversation where the professor learns about the student's cultural background and educational experiences. The student learns about British academic culture and why individual work is valued. They come to understand that rules are different here, even if they think those rules are strange. The professor agrees to let the student redo the assignment individually without further penalty, recognizing this was a cultural misunderstanding rather than intentional dishonesty. Moving forward, the student knows the rules and follows them, though they might still privately think they're silly. This is cultural adaptation, learning to follow the rules of the culture you're in while maintaining your own values. Internally, the worst-case scenario is the professor doesn't care about cultural, context and punishes the student harshly, maybe even trying to have them expelled for cheating. This is cultural insensitivity and poor pedagogy. It punishes a student for not knowing unspoken rules and doesn't recognize that academic integrity norms are culturally specific. This kind of response would create resentment, make international students feel unwelcome, and potentially escalate into an international incident if the student's family and government get involved. Hogwarts would need training for staff on cultural competency and policies that distinguish between intentional dishonesty and cultural misunderstanding. Scenario 2. A Muslim student requests accommodations during Ramadan, wanting to be excused from classes during afternoon prayer time and needing a private place to pray. Some British students and parents complain that this is special treatment, and religious students should follow the same rules as everyone else. There's tension and debate about whether religious accommodations are appropriate or whether they create inequality. The right response is that Hogwarts accommodates religious practices as much as reasonably possible. The student is given access to a quiet room for prayer and excused from class during prayer times with the understanding they'll make up any missed work. This is not special treatment. It's recognizing that students have diverse needs and practices that should be respected. The British students complaining need education about religious freedom and diversity. Just because something isn't required by your religion doesn't mean accommodating others' religions is unfair to you. Hogwarts would need clear policies on religious accommodations, communicated to all students and families, so there's no confusion about what's expected and what's allowed. Scenario 3. A physical altercation breaks out between a British student and an international student. Words were exchanged, insults were made, and it escalated to magical violence. When they're brought before the headmaster or disciplinary committee, each tells a very different story about what happened and who started it. Cultural differences in communication style and conflict escalation make it hard to determine what actually occurred. This requires careful investigation, probably involving multiple staff members, possibly even consulting with cultural liaisons who can help interpret the students' accounts through culturally appropriate lenses. Both students need to understand that physical violence is unacceptable, regardless of cultural background or provocation. They need consequences that are fair and proportional, but they also need education. What insults or behaviors led to the altercation? Were there cultural misunderstandings that escalated tensions? Do these students need mediation to understand each other's perspectives? The goal isn't just punishment, but learning, growth, and prevention of future conflicts. This is restorative justice in an educational context, holding students accountable while helping them become better people who can coexist peacefully despite differences. Scenario 4. An international student is caught practicing magic that's legal in their home country, but illegal in Britain. Maybe they cast a spell that British law categorizes as dark magic, but their culture sees as legitimate. They argue they should be allowed to follow their own country's laws, not Britain's. British students and parents are outraged that someone might get away with practicing dark magic at Hogwarts. This is legally and ethically complex. Hogwarts is in Britain and probably needs to follow British magical law to maintain its operating license and relationship with the ministry. Students who attend Hogwarts need to follow the rules, even if those rules differ from their home country's laws. That's part of the agreement when they enroll. However, there's room for education rather than just punishment. The student should learn why British law forbids this magic and what values and history led to that prohibition. They might still disagree, thinking British law is wrong, but they need to respect it while at Hogwarts. In return, British students should learn that magical ethics are complex, and their country's approach is not the only valid one. This is an opportunity for comparative magical ethics education that benefits everyone. Scenario 5. A student is receiving threatening letters from family members back home who have discovered something about their life at Hogwarts they disapprove of. Maybe the student is in a relationship with someone from a rival nation or ethnic group. Maybe they've come out as gay. Maybe they've been advocating for political views their family considers treasonous. The threats are serious enough that the student fears for their safety if they return home during holidays or after graduation. This is a crisis situation requiring immediate intervention from school counselors, administrators, and possibly even international magical law enforcement. The student's safety is paramount. Hogwarts may need to work with international agencies to ensure the student has legal protection. The student may need to seek refugee status or asylum in Britain or another country if they can't safely return home. This is heartbreaking and traumatic for the student, who may lose their family and home country over their choices and identity. Hogwarts needs support systems for students in these extreme situations, recognizing that international education can sometimes lead to family ruptures when students' worldviews diverge from their family's traditional values. These scenarios illustrate that an international Hogwarts would be dealing with complex, difficult situations that require wisdom, cultural competency, and institutional flexibility. There are no easy answers to many of these challenges. The school would need excellent administration, well-trained staff, clear policies, and commitment to both maintaining standards and accommodating diversity. It would be messy and complicated, and mistakes would be made. But the alternative, maintaining the status quo of segregated magical education, means missing out on all the benefits that international exchange and diversity bring. Let's think about the long-term impacts on students' lives and identities after leaving Hogwarts. 7 years is a long time, especially during adolescence when identity is forming. Students who spend these formative years in an international environment would be fundamentally shaped by that experience. They'd develop what researchers call third-culture kid identities. People who were raised in cultures different from their parents' cultures and develop a sense of identity that's not fully connected to any single culture, but draws from multiple influences. For some graduates, this would be empowering and exciting. They'd see themselves as global citizens, comfortable in multiple cultural contexts, able to build bridges between communities. Their friend networks would span the globe. They'd be multilingual, culturally competent, and comfortable with ambiguity and diversity. These graduates would be ideally suited for careers in international magical organizations, diplomacy, global magical business, or any field requiring cross-cultural skills. They'd be the leaders of an increasingly interconnected magical world, having learned to navigate cultural differences during their most formative years. But for other graduates, the third culture kid experience would be more challenging. They might struggle with feeling like they don't fully belong anywhere. When they return home after graduation, they might feel alienated from people who didn't have their international experiences. Their families and childhood friends might seem narrow-minded or provincial. But they also wouldn't be fully British despite spending 7 years at Hogwarts. They'd be culturally in between, which can be lonely and disorienting. These graduates would need support networks, perhaps alumni organizations that help them maintain connections with people who shared similar experiences and understand the challenges of living between cultures. The marriage and family formation patterns of international Hogwarts alumni would be interesting to observe over time. Many would probably marry other alumni from different countries, having formed deep connections during school. These international marriages would produce children with multicultural identities from birth, raised by parents from different cultural backgrounds, possibly living in a third country entirely, speaking multiple languages at home. These children would be truly global citizens. Over generations, if this pattern continued, you'd see the emergence of a genuinely international magical community with shared cultural references and experiences that transcend national boundaries. However, some graduates would choose to marry within their own cultural and national communities, perhaps feeling a need to reconnect with their roots after years immersed in international environment. They might have had positive experiences at Hogwarts, but ultimately decide they want to raise their own children firmly rooted in their home culture. This is a legitimate choice. Not everyone has to embrace internationalism fully. The beauty of Hogwarts education would be giving students choices and perspectives they wouldn't otherwise have, not forcing them into any particular identity or life path. Career paths for international Hogwarts alumni would be diverse. Some would return home and work within their national magical communities, bringing back knowledge and perspectives that could modernize and improve their home institutions. A graduate returning to work in their national Ministry of Magic with experience in international cooperation and diverse magical traditions would be valuable for modernizing that ministry. A graduate opening a business in their home country with international connections and cross-cultural competence would have advantages over competitors. Without those experiences, others would pursue explicitly international careers. The International Confederation of Wizards, the global magical governing body mentioned in the books, would love to recruit Hogwarts graduates with proven ability to work across cultural boundaries. International magical businesses would compete for employees with language skills, cultural competence, and international networks. International magical research institutions would value scientists who can collaborate with colleagues from any cultural background and integrate knowledge from multiple magical traditions. Diplomatic services worldwide would recruit heavily from international Hogwarts alumni. Some graduates would stay in Britain, either because they fell in love with the country during their school years or because they found opportunities there. Britain would benefit enormously from this, gaining talented immigrants who already speak English, understand British culture, and have connections to communities worldwide. British magical society would gradually become more diverse and cosmopolitan as international Hogwarts graduates settled there, married British citizens, started businesses, and raised families. This demographic shift would transform British magical culture over decades, making it less insular and more open to global influences. The political impact of international Hogwarts alumni would be significant. As these graduates moved into leadership positions in their home countries, they'd have personal connections with leaders in other countries who were their classmates or friends at Hogwarts. International magical diplomacy would increasingly be conducted between people who went to school together, shared dormitories, played Quidditch together, maybe even dated each other. These personal connections wouldn't prevent all conflicts, but they'd provide channels for communication and relationship capital that could help resolve tensions before they escalated into serious conflicts. Imagine two magical nations facing a diplomatic crisis. Their ministers of magic were Hogwarts classmates 20 years ago. They were in different houses, but they took classes together, worked on group projects, maybe played in the same Quidditch tournament. They can pick up a communication mirror or write a letter and say, "Look, I know our governments are at odds, but you and I know each other. Let's figure out how to de-escalate this before it gets out of hand." That personal connection, that shared history, could make the difference between conflict and peaceful resolution. This is the promise of international education, building human connections that transcend national boundaries and create networks of trust and communication. A more progressive Hogwarts might need to reconsider the house system entirely. Perhaps keep the 4 houses but de-emphasize their importance, treating them more as administrative divisions for dormitory assignments rather than identity-defining groups. Or perhaps expand the system, adding new houses that reflect different values. Though that would fundamentally change Hogwarts architecture and traditions in ways that might be too radical even for an international transformation. There's also the question of how students form friendships and social groups across cultural and linguistic barriers. Even with translation charms, communication is about more than just words. It's about shared references, humor, body language, personal space norms, eye contact expectations, and 1,000 other subtle cultural factors. A joke that's hilarious in Brazilian culture might be offensive in Japanese culture. A friendly gesture in one culture might be inappropriate in another. Students would need cultural competency education, probably workshops during their first year teaching them about different cultural norms and how to navigate a diverse social environment. This is standard in many international schools in the Muggle world, but would be completely novel for Hogwarts. Romantic relationships would add another layer of complexity. Dating norms vary enormously across cultures. Some cultures are very open about teenage romance. Others consider it inappropriate. Physical affection that's perfectly acceptable in one culture might be scandalous in another. The Yule Ball that happened during the Triwizard Tournament in Goblet of Fire was awkward enough with just British students and 2 visiting schools. Imagine organizing dances and social events for a truly international student body, with vastly different expectations about proper behavior between boys and girls, or between students of any genders. The school administration would need clear policies, probably erring on the side of conservatism to avoid offending anyone, which might make social events less fun, but more universally accessible. Friendship formation in this environment might initially follow ethnic or linguistic lines, which is natural when you're in an unfamiliar environment and seeking people who share your background. You'd probably see clusters of students from the same regions eating together, studying together, socializing together. This isn't necessarily bad. It's human nature to seek familiar comfort. But it could lead to a school that's diverse on paper but quite segregated in practice, with different national or regional groups having little interaction beyond required classes. Hogwarts would need to actively promote integration, perhaps through mixed nationality study groups, collaborative projects that require students from different backgrounds to work together, and extracurricular activities that attract diverse participants. Quidditch becomes fascinating in this context. Currently, Quidditch at Hogwarts is organized by house teams. If the house system is de-emphasized in an international Hogwarts, how is Quidditch organized? Do you have national teams, turning the school Quidditch season into a miniature World Cup? That could be exciting but might reinforce national divisions rather than school unity. Or do you form mixed teams deliberately, putting together players from different countries and having them develop team cohesion despite their differences? That's a nice ideal but might be frustrating for students who want to play with people from their own culture who they communicate with more easily. And what about students who come from magical traditions that don't play Quidditch? Quidditch seems to be primarily a British and European sport, spreading to America and other places through British magical influence. But there must be other magical sports. Do these get represented? Does Hogwarts' athletic program expand to include diverse magical sports from around the world? That would be genuinely exciting, offering students options beyond Quidditch and introducing British students to sports they've never seen. But it requires facilities, equipment, and coaches who know these sports. The logistical and financial investment would be substantial. Food is always important to student life, and the Great Hall feasts would transform completely. Currently, Hogwarts serves traditional British food: roast beef, Yorkshire puddings, treacle tart, spotted dick, and so forth. It's hearty traditional fare that British students are familiar with. But this cuisine would be completely alien and possibly unappetizing to students from other parts of the world. A student from India who's used to rich, spiced curries might find British food bland and unpalatable. A student from Japan expecting rice, fish, and pickled vegetables would be lost looking at unfamiliar dishes. Students with specific dietary requirements based on religion or culture, like halal, kosher, Hindu vegetarian, or Buddhist vegetarian, would need accommodation. The house elves in the kitchen would need to dramatically expand their repertoire, learning to cook cuisines from around the world. Actually, given that house elves have magical powers, they could probably conjure or summon traditional dishes from anywhere, but they'd need to know what to make. Perhaps the menu becomes rotating, with different days featuring different regional cuisines. Monday is Chinese food, Tuesday is Italian, Wednesday is West African, Thursday is Middle Eastern, Friday is Japanese, Saturday is Latin American, Sunday is traditional British for old time's sake. This exposes everyone to diverse foods and gives each regional group regular access to familiar comfort food. The Great Hall tables would look dramatically different, filled with a rainbow of cuisines, and meals would become cross-cultural experiences where students try each other's traditional foods and expand their palates. Religious accommodations would be necessary too. Hogwarts currently celebrates Christmas quite thoroughly, with decorations, feasts, and students going home for the holidays. But Christmas is a Christian holiday, and an international student body would include Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, practitioners of traditional indigenous religions, and students from secular families who don't celebrate anything in particular. Hogwarts would need to recognize diverse holidays. Diwali, Eid, Lunar New Year, Hanukkah, and others would need to be acknowledged, with students allowed to celebrate their own traditions and perhaps sharing these celebrations with the wider school community. This could be enriching, turning the school year into a series of cultural celebrations that educate everyone. But it requires sensitivity, respect, and space for diverse practices. Hogwarts would probably need a multi-faith prayer and meditation room, something that definitely doesn't exist in the current castle. The common rooms and dormitories would need serious rethinking. Currently, each house has its own common room and dormitories separated by gender. Would international students want to stay with their housemates or with people from their own cultural background? There's value in both approaches. Living with housemates promotes integration and school unity. Living with people from your own culture provides comfort and support when you're far from home. Perhaps Hogwarts could offer both options: house dormitories for students who want full integration, and international houses or floors where students from specific regions can live together if they prefer. Flexibility would be key. Hygiene and bathroom facilities might need adjustment too. Different cultures have different norms around bathing, bathroom privacy, and cleanliness. The shared bathrooms in Hogwarts might be uncomfortable for students from cultures with different modesty standards. The prefect's bathroom, with its swimming pool-sized bathtub, might seem scandalous to students from conservative backgrounds. Hogwarts would need to provide options, perhaps private bathing facilities alongside the communal ones, accommodating diverse comfort levels. Clothing is another area where cultural differences would be visible daily. Hogwarts has a uniform, the black robes with house colors. This creates visual unity and equality, everyone dressed the same regardless of wealth or background. But it also erases cultural identity. Students from cultures with specific dress traditions might want to incorporate elements of their heritage into their daily wear. Perhaps Hogwarts allows modifications to the standard uniform, letting students add cultural accessories, headscarves, jewelry with cultural significance, or other personal touches that maintain the basic uniform structure while allowing individual expression. This would make the hallways of Hogwarts much more visually diverse and interesting. Let's think about the staff for a moment. An international student body would almost certainly require a more diverse faculty. Currently, Hogwarts professors are almost entirely British, with occasional exceptions like Professor Quirrell, who traveled. But if you're teaching students from around the world, having professors who understand different cultural contexts and educational backgrounds is essential. Hogwarts would need to recruit internationally, bringing in teachers from different magical traditions. A potions professor who trained in Asia, a charms professor from Africa, a transfiguration specialist from South America. These professors would bring different teaching styles, different knowledge bases, and different perspectives on magic. This diversity in teaching staff would enrich education for everyone, including British students, who would be exposed to magical knowledge and techniques they wouldn't encounter otherwise. But it would also require the staff to work together effectively, despite potential differences in teaching philosophy, language, and cultural expectations. Staff meetings would need translation charms. Curriculum development would become a complex negotiation between different educational traditions. Disputes between staff members might arise from cultural misunderstandings. Dumbledore, McGonagall, or whoever is headmaster or headmistress would need exceptional leadership skills to manage a diverse international faculty, requiring cultural sensitivity, flexibility, and strong mediation abilities. Support staff would need expansion too. The school would probably need counselors or advisors specifically assigned to help international students adjust to life at Hogwarts and in Britain. These staff members would need to understand the specific challenges faced by students from different backgrounds: homesickness, culture shock, academic adjustment, social integration difficulties. In the books, the heads of house supposedly provide pastoral care, but they're already busy with teaching and administrative duties. A school with hundreds of international students dealing with much more complex adjustment issues would need dedicated support staff. Medical care is another consideration. Madame Pomfrey is excellent at treating magical injuries and illnesses, but different regions might have different magical diseases or conditions she's never encountered. A student from the tropics might carry exposure to magical parasites that don't exist in Britain. Traditional healing practices from different cultures might use different approaches than the European magical medicine Madame Pomfrey practices. The hospital wing would need to either expand Madame Pomfrey's knowledge base enormously or bring in additional healers with diverse expertise. There's also the question of Muggle medicine. Some families might have religious or cultural objections to certain treatments. Others might come from traditions that integrate magic and non-magical healing differently than British magical medicine does. Discipline and rule enforcement would become more nuanced. Different cultures have different norms around authority, punishment, and appropriate behavior. British magical education seems to accept corporal punishment as recently as the books take place, with Filch nostalgically mentioning whipping and chains, though actual teachers use detentions and point deductions. Some cultures might find detention, especially the dangerous detentions Hagrid sometimes assigns, like going into the Forbidden Forest, completely inappropriate. Other cultures might expect much stricter discipline than Hogwarts provides. The code of conduct would need to be clearly communicated and fairly applied across cultural differences, which is challenging when different students might not even agree on what constitutes misbehavior. The relationship between students and teachers might also vary culturally. British culture, at least in educational settings, maintains a fair amount of distance between students and teachers. Teachers are called by their titles: Professor Snape, Professor McGonagall. There's formality and hierarchy, but in some cultures, teachers are accorded even more respect and authority, essentially seen as surrogate parents or community elders. In other cultures, education might be more egalitarian, with students expected to question and challenge teachers as part of the learning process. These different expectations could lead to misunderstandings. A student who questions a teacher might be seen as appropriately engaged in their own culture, but disrespectful in British educational culture. A student who's very deferential might be seen as lacking curiosity or confidence. Let's consider the broader impact on magical society beyond just the school. An internationally diverse Hogwarts would produce alumni with global networks and perspectives. British witches and wizards who graduated from Hogwarts would have friendships and connections all over the world. This could transform British magical society, making it less insular and more internationally engaged. But this might be precisely what conservative elements of British magical society fear. The whole plot of the original Harry Potter series involves significant prejudice against Muggle-borns, half-bloods, and non-human magical beings. These same prejudiced elements would almost certainly oppose international integration, seeing it as a threat to pure-blood British magical culture. Slytherin House would be a particular challenge in this context. Slytherin has historically attracted pure-blood supremacists and those who believe in blood purity and British magical tradition. How do you integrate international students into a house with these historical associations? Some international students might actually find Slytherin's emphasis on ambition, cunning, and resourcefulness appealing, regardless of the blood purity baggage. A student from a highly competitive academic culture might be sorted into Slytherin based on their drive to succeed, but they'd be entering a house with a complicated legacy of prejudice. Hopefully, an international student body would help reform Slytherin's culture, diluting the pureblood ideology by making it clear that magical talent and ambition exist in every ethnicity and nationality. The wizarding economy would be affected too. International students need to buy supplies, and not just once. They need robes, they break wands, they run out of parchment and ink. If hundreds of international students are shopping in Diagon Alley multiple times a year, that's a significant economic boost. Shops might start catering to international customers, stocking products from different magical traditions, hiring multilingual staff. Diagon Alley could become a truly international magical marketplace. The same applies to Hogsmeade, the wizarding village near Hogwarts. On Hogsmeade weekends, students spend money at Honeydukes, Zonko's, the Three Broomsticks. An international student body with diverse tastes and deeper pockets, since many would be from wealthy families if they're paying international fees, would transform Hogsmeade's economy. Shops might diversify their offerings to appeal to different tastes. The magical media would change too. The Daily Prophet might start covering international magical news more seriously, if their readership includes families of international students wanting to know what's happening at Hogwarts and in Britain. International magical newspapers might establish British correspondents. Student publications like the Quibbler or any school newspapers would become more globally aware. Students would bring perspectives on international issues that British students might be ignorant about or view only through a British lens. Sports, especially Quidditch, would benefit immensely. Having students from every Quidditch-playing nation means having players who grew up with different styles and strategies. The level of play would improve dramatically. British students would learn techniques from Bulgarian seekers, Irish chasers, Japanese beaters. Students from countries without strong Quidditch traditions might get introduced to the sport and bring it back home, spreading Quidditch's popularity globally. Of course, as mentioned before, introducing other magical sports to Hogwarts would diversify athletics and give students more options for physical activity and competition. Academically, the competition might intensify. Different educational systems have different standards and different focuses. Students from high-pressure academic cultures might arrive with incredibly strong work ethics and advanced knowledge in certain areas. This could raise the overall academic level, pushing everyone to work harder and achieve more. But it could also create stress and unhealthy competition. Hogwarts would need to foster a culture of collaborative learning and mutual support rather than cutthroat competition. This is easier said than done, especially when you have students from cultures that emphasize individual achievement and ranking. The OWL and NEWT exams, the standardized tests students take in 5th and 7th year, would need serious revision. Currently, these exams are set by the British Ministry of Magic and test knowledge of British magical curriculum. If Hogwarts is teaching a more diverse international curriculum, the exams need to reflect that. Or perhaps they don't. Maybe Hogwarts continues to prepare students for British magical qualifications, and international students take these exams knowing they're getting British credentials. This would be similar to how international students in Muggle Britain take British A-levels or GCSEs. But Hogwarts might also offer preparation for other nations' magical qualifications. A student planning to return to Japan after Hogwarts might need to take Japanese magical examinations to qualify for work there. Offering exam preparation for multiple qualification systems would be complex, but might be necessary to truly serve an international student body. Career counseling would become much more sophisticated. Currently, Hogwarts career advice seems to be Professor McGonagall asking students what they want to do and then telling them what NEUTs they need. For international students, career counseling needs to consider global magical job markets, different nations' qualification requirements, and the realities of working across borders. A student might want to work for the International Confederation of Wizards, requiring knowledge of international magical law and fluency in multiple languages. Another might want to return home and work in their national ministry, needing to understand how their British education translates to their home country's requirements. The Career Guidance Office would need staff with international expertise and resources on global magical career paths. Let's talk about some of the potential darker aspects of this scenario, because not everything would be positive. Whenever you have a diverse group living in close quarters, there's potential for conflict. Cultural misunderstandings can escalate into arguments or even fights. Students might form exclusive national or ethnic groups that exclude others. Bullying could take on racist or xenophobic dimensions, with students targeting others for being foreign, for speaking differently, for having different customs. While British students certainly bully each other in the books, adding national and ethnic dimensions could make bullying more vicious and more damaging. Hogwarts would need a zero-tolerance policy on racist, xenophobic, or ethnically based bullying, with clear consequences and active intervention from staff. But enforcement would be challenging because microaggressions and subtle prejudices are harder to address than overt slurs or violence. A British student might not even realize they're being offensive when they make assumptions about an international student based on stereotypes. Educational programs on diversity, equity, and inclusion would be essential from first year onward. These are topics that the magical world generally seems to ignore, given their terrible handling of issues around Muggleborns, werewolves, goblins, and other discriminated groups. There's also the potential for international tensions in the Muggle world to spill into Hogwarts. If two countries are in conflict, diplomatically or even militarily in the Muggle world, students from those countries might bring those tensions to school. During the books, we see how events in the wider magical world, like Voldemort's return or the Ministry's interference, affect the school. International conflicts could be even more complex. Does Hogwarts take a position on international disputes? Does it maintain strict neutrality? How do you maintain a safe, supportive environment for students from countries that are enemies in the outside world? Security would be a major concern for everyone involved. Parents from around the world are trusting Hogwarts with their children's safety. Different nations would have different security expectations and requirements. Some might insist on their own security personnel being present at Hogwarts. Others might require regular welfare checks on their students. Hogwarts' traditional security, which seems to consist of Dumbledore's personal power, some enchantments, and not much else given how often students end up in mortal danger, would be completely inadequate for an international school. Professional security measures would be necessary. Background checks for all staff, secure facilities, emergency protocols for various scenarios, regular communication with parents and governments about student welfare. Then there's the issue of students going home for holidays or in emergencies. If there's a family emergency and a student needs to get home to Japan immediately, how does that work? With British students, they can fly home or catch the Hogwarts Express on an emergency basis. International students need international magical transportation on short notice, which is complicated and expensive. Hogwarts would need protocols and probably dedicated staff to handle emergency travel arrangements. Health and safety regulations might differ by country. Britain might consider certain magical practices or creatures safe for educational purposes that other countries would find unacceptably dangerous. Remember that Hagrid's idea of appropriate care of magical creatures lessons included blast-ended scroots, hippogriffs, and other potentially lethal beasts. Some nations' magical governments might have strict safety regulations that Hogwarts would need to comply with for their students. This could mean different rules for different students in the same class, which would be a logistical nightmare for professors. There's a question of whether international students would be allowed to perform magic outside of school in Britain during the summer holidays. British students can't use magic outside school until they're of age at 17, with the trace tracking underage magic. But do international students staying in Britain for the summer have the same restrictions? If they're from countries with different age of majority laws or different attitudes toward underage magic, this could be contentious. And what about when they go home? Hogwarts can't enforce British magical law in other countries. Students might go home and use magic freely if their home countries allow it, which British students might see as unfair. Let's think about the physical castle for a moment. Hogwarts Castle is ancient, full of staircases that move, doors that aren't really doors, rooms that change, and 7 floors of medieval architecture. It's charming and magical, but also confusing and not particularly accessible. For British students who've grown up with stories about Hogwarts and are mentally prepared for magical strangeness, this is part of the experience. For international students from completely different magical traditions, Hogwarts might be overwhelmingly confusing and even alienating. The castle doesn't feel like home. It feels like a foreign, maze-like place where they're constantly lost. The Hogwarts staff would need to make efforts to help the castle feel welcoming to everyone. Maybe sections of the castle are decorated to reflect different cultural aesthetics, so international students can find spaces that feel familiar. Maybe the castle itself, which is clearly somewhat sentient given the moving staircases and responsive architecture, adapts to its more diverse population, developing new routes and spaces that accommodate different needs. This is fancifully optimistic, but in a magical castle, perhaps not impossible. Accessibility is worth mentioning too. Hogwarts is not at all accessible for anyone with physical disabilities. Stairs everywhere, no elevators, uneven floors, and a general assumption that everyone is able-bodied. An international student body would likely include students with disabilities, and Hogwarts would need to adapt. Magic offers solutions that Muggle buildings don't have. Levitation charms could help students who can't climb stairs. Magical mobility aids could be far more sophisticated than Muggle wheelchairs or canes. But this requires awareness, effort, and resources. Hopefully, an international Hogwarts would embrace inclusivity in all its forms, including disability accommodations. Let's consider some specific scenarios to make this more concrete. Imagine a student from Mahutakoro in Japan arriving at Hogwarts. They're used to a school on a volcanic island, wearing enchanted robes that change color as they learn and improve. They practice wandless magic, and their education emphasizes perfection and discipline. They arrive at Hogwarts and find a drafty medieval castle, students in plain black robes, everyone using wands, and a much more relaxed attitude toward magical discipline. This is culture shock. They might feel that Hogwarts is inferior, or at least very different from what they're used to. But over time, they might come to appreciate different aspects. The house system providing a sense of belonging, the less rigid structure allowing for more creativity and exploration, the friendships that form across national boundaries. And they share their own traditions, teaching classmates wandless techniques, explaining Japanese magical philosophy, participating in cultural exchange that enriches everyone. Or imagine a student from Ouagadougou in Africa. They come from the largest wizarding school in the world, a place where magic is deeply integrated with African cultural traditions, where wandless magic is standard, where astronomy and alchemy are core subjects. They arrive at a much smaller school in Scotland where they're one of relatively few African students, where everyone uses wands, where the curriculum is Eurocentric. They might face racism, both overt and subtle. They might feel isolated and struggle to find community. But if Hogwarts is doing this right, they also find support from other international students who share the experience of being far from home, from staff members who are committed to diversity and inclusion, and eventually from British students who are curious and open-minded enough to learn from them. They might start a club for African students and allies, creating space to celebrate their cultures. They might work to diversify the curriculum, proposing new classes or units that incorporate African magical traditions. They become agents of change, making Hogwarts better and more inclusive for future generations. Imagine a pure-blood British student, perhaps from a family like the Malfoys, who has been raised with beliefs about British magical superiority and blood purity. They arrive at Hogwarts expecting it to be a bastion of tradition, and instead find it full of foreign students who don't know or care about British pure-blood lineages, who practice magic in ways they were taught were inferior, who challenge every assumption they've been raised with. This is threatening to their worldview. They might initially react with hostility, racism, and attempts to maintain their sense of superiority. But over 7 years, if Hogwarts is doing its educational job, They're forced to confront the reality that magical talent, intelligence, and worth have nothing to do with nationality or blood status. They form reluctant friendships with people they were taught to despise. They learn that their provincial upbringing gave them a very limited view of the magical world. They might not completely abandon their prejudices, people rarely do completely, but they evolve. And some students from these backgrounds might more fully embrace the diversity they encounter, recognizing that what they were taught was wrong and choosing a different path. This is the optimistic outcome, the educational ideal that exposure to diversity reduces prejudice. Of course, some students wouldn't change. Some would graduate still believing in British magical superiority or pure-blood ideology, resentful of the changes to Hogwarts and blaming international students for diluting what they see as tradition. These graduates might form the core of opposition to international Hogwarts, writing editorials, lobbying the ministry, perhaps even engaging in harassment or violence against international students or alumni. Social change always faces backlash from those invested in the old system. Let's think about romance and dating in this environment. Teenage romance is part of the Hogwarts experience, as we see throughout the books. An international student body makes this more complex and potentially more interesting. Intercultural relationships would be common, with students dating across national and ethnic lines. These relationships would involve navigating different cultural expectations about dating, physical affection, commitment, and what's appropriate at what age. Some relationships would fail because of these differences. Others would succeed because the students involved are willing to learn about and respect each other's backgrounds. These relationships would produce deeper cultural understanding as students learn about their partner's culture, language, and traditions. Some families might oppose intercultural relationships, wanting their children to date within their own national or ethnic group. Students would face pressure from home to break up with partners their families disapprove of based on nationality or ethnicity. This is painful and complicated, touching on issues of family loyalty, cultural preservation, and individual autonomy. Hogwarts would need counselors who can help students navigate these situations. Weddings of Hogwarts alumni who met at school would become international celebrations, blending traditions from different cultures. You might have a wedding that incorporates both British and Indian traditions, or Japanese and Nigerian, creating new hybrid cultural practices. The children of these unions would grow up genuinely multicultural, comfortable in multiple cultural contexts, fluent in multiple languages, truly global citizens of the magical world. Over generations, this could fundamentally transform magical society globally, breaking down national barriers and creating a more integrated international magical community. But let's not romanticize this too much. Intercultural relationships can also be sites of cultural appropriation, fetishization, and power imbalances. A British student might date someone from an exotic foreign country not out of genuine respect and interest, but because they find the foreignness appealing in a superficial way. International students from less economically developed countries might face stereotypes and assumptions. Power dynamics between students from more and less privileged backgrounds could play out in unhealthy ways. Again, education about cultural respect, equity, and healthy relationships would be essential. Secret societies and student organizations would proliferate in an international Hogwarts. We see in the books that students form groups like Dumbledore's Army when they need to. In an international school, you'd have cultural clubs, language practice groups, international student associations, groups organized around shared interests that transcend national boundaries. These organizations would be vital for student well-being and integration, providing spaces where students can maintain connections to their home cultures while also forming new connections at Hogwarts. The school administration would need to support these groups while also ensuring they don't become exclusive or divisive. Academic competitions would take on new dimensions. We saw the Triwizard Tournament in the books, which was supposed to promote international magical cooperation. An international Hogwarts would have internal competitions that serve a similar function. Maybe an annual academic tournament where mixed nationality teams compete in magical challenges, requiring students from different backgrounds to work together. Or showcase events where students present projects about their home country's magical traditions, educating each other and celebrating diversity. These events would be highlights of the school year, promoting both competition and cooperation. The selection and tenure of the headmaster or headmistress would become an international concern. Currently, the Hogwarts Board of Governors, appointed by the British Ministry, has input into the head's selection. With an international student body, other magical governments would demand a say in school leadership. You might need an international board of governors with representatives from multiple countries. This would make school governance much more complex, with decisions requiring consensus among parties with different priorities and perspectives. It would also make the head's job much harder, as they'd need to satisfy multiple governments and constituencies. The head would need to be an exceptional diplomat, as well as an educational leader. Let's think about the founder's legacy in this context. Hogwarts was founded over 1,000 years ago by 4 medieval British wizards, Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin. The school's entire identity is built on their vision and their values. Salazar Slytherin specifically opposed teaching Muggleborns, believing Hogwarts should be pure blood only, which led to his split with the other founders. The Chamber of Secrets, which he built, was intended to purge the school of Muggleborns when his heir returned. This is dark history, but it's fundamental to Hogwarts. An international Hogwarts would need to grapple with this legacy. The founders were products of their time and place, medieval Britain, and their values reflected that context. Expanding Hogwarts internationally means moving beyond the founders' vision in significant ways. This might be controversial among traditionalists who see the founders' legacy as sacred, but it might also be necessary and even liberating, acknowledging that values and institutions can evolve beyond their origins while still respecting foundational principles. Perhaps the core of what the founders believed, that magical education is valuable, and that students with different strengths all deserve education, remains true even as the implementation changes dramatically. The school motto is Draco Dormiens Nunquam Titilandus, which means never. Tickle a sleeping dragon. This is whimsical and very British in its dry humor. Would an international Hogwarts keep this motto or adopt something more universally meaningful? Perhaps they keep it for tradition's sake, but maybe they add mottos in other languages, creating a collection of principles that reflect the diversity of the student body. Or maybe the motto's essential message about respecting danger and not provoking things that can harm you is universal enough to work for everyone. Let's consider what happens after graduation. Alumni of an international Hogwarts would be scattered across the globe. The alumni network would be incredibly powerful and valuable, providing connections in every magical community worldwide. An international Hogwarts degree would presumably be prestigious, recognized globally. Graduates would be prepared for careers in international magical organizations, multinational magical businesses, diplomatic service, global magical research, and any field where cross-cultural competence and international connections are valuable. They'd be the leaders of a more integrated magical world, having learned to work across cultural boundaries during their formative years. But some graduates might struggle to reintegrate into their home communities after spending 7 years in an international environment. They might feel like they no longer fully belong to any single national culture, becoming perpetually in between. Third culture kids, as they're called in social science research, often report feeling like cultural bridges but also feeling rootless. Hogwarts graduates might face this, needing to navigate between their British magical education and their home cultural identity. This is a real psychological and social challenge that the magical world would need to recognize and support. Employment discrimination might be an issue. Would British magical employers prefer British-educated Hogwarts graduates over international students who also attended Hogwarts? Would international students face assumptions that they're less qualified or less culturally compatible? Or would their diverse perspectives and international networks make them more attractive to forward-thinking employers? Probably a mix, depending on the employer and the broader political climate. Hogwarts's career services would need to prepare international students for potential discrimination and help them leverage their unique strengths. Now, let's zoom out even further and think about the political ramifications on a global scale. An internationally integrated Hogwarts could be a model for other wizarding schools. If it succeeds, if it produces benefits like better educated students, stronger international cooperation, and reduced prejudice, other schools might follow suit. Beauxbatons might start accepting students beyond France. Ilvermorny might expand beyond North America. Over time, the entire system of regionally segregated magical education could break down, replaced by a more cosmopolitan system where students choose schools based on fit rather than geography. This would represent a fundamental restructuring of the magical world's educational and social systems. It would reduce the power of national magical governments and increase the importance of international institutions. The International Confederation of Wizards might become more powerful and relevant as schools and students operate across borders. International magical law would need to develop significantly to handle the complexities of transnational education. This is globalization of the magical world, with all the opportunities and challenges that entails. Some nations might resist this trend, maintaining their own closed educational systems as a matter of national identity and sovereignty. There might be a split between more cosmopolitan magical nations that embrace international education and more conservative ones that insist on maintaining national magical culture through education. This could create new international divisions, ironically emerging from an effort to increase integration. The magical world might end up more politically complex, with alliances and rivalries forming around attitudes toward educational integration and internationalism. There's also the question of whether this makes the magical world safer or more dangerous. On one hand, international integration and the relationships formed at school could reduce the likelihood of international magical conflicts. Leaders who were friends at Hogwarts might find it harder to send their nations to war against each other. Understanding other cultures reduces fear and prejudice, which are often roots of conflict. On the other hand, gathering students from dozens of countries in one place creates a target. If Voldemort or another dark wizard wanted to strike a blow against multiple magical nations at once, an international Hogwarts would be ideal. Security concerns would be immense and constant. The economic implications globally are significant. An international Hogwarts would likely charge substantial tuition to international students or receive payments from their governments. This money could fund improvements to facilities, faculty salaries, scholarships for less privileged students. But it also means Hogwarts is operating partially as a business, which might corrupt its educational mission. There's tension between maintaining high educational standards and access for all qualified students versus generating revenue and serving as an elite international institution. The location of Hogwarts in Scotland becomes interesting in this context. Scotland is relatively remote and has its own distinct cultural identity within the UK. An international Hogwarts might strengthen Scottish magical culture and economy, making Scotland a center of international magical activity. But it might also create tension with England and the British Ministry of Magic. If Scotland ever pursued magical independence, which might mirror debates about Muggle Scottish independence, control of Hogwarts would be a major issue. Who owns this international institution? Britain, Scotland, or the international community? Let's think about what this means for the series' original narrative. So much of Harry Potter's plot depends on Hogwarts being a specifically British institution embedded in British magical society. Voldemort's targeting of Hogwarts makes sense because it's the heart of British magical culture. The Ministry's takeover of the school in Order of the Phoenix and Deathly Hallows works because Hogwarts is under British jurisdiction. Many plot points would be complicated or impossible in an international Hogwarts. The story would need to be fundamentally different, probably focused more on international themes, diplomatic intrigue, and cross-cultural conflict and cooperation. Voldemort's ideology of pure-blood supremacy might face different challenges in an international context. His movement was specifically about British pure-blood wizards dominating British magical society. In an international Hogwarts, his ideology might not resonate with international students who don't share British pure-blood obsessions. Or alternatively, his ideology might gain international adherents who share beliefs about magical racial purity, even if they're not British. We know from Grindelwald's story that dark wizards can build international movements. Voldemort might do the same if he positioned himself as a champion of wizarding, kind against Muggles globally rather than focusing narrowly on British concerns. Dumbledore's role would be even more significant in an international Hogwarts. His influence would extend to students from every nation, making him a truly global figure in magical education. His philosophy of love, tolerance, and the power of choice would be taught to students worldwide, potentially shaping an entire generation of international magical leaders. Conversely, if someone with bad intentions became headmaster of an international Hogwarts, the damage they could do would be enormous, influencing thousands of students from across the globe. The selection and oversight of school leadership would be critical. perhaps requiring international consensus and stringent accountability. Teachers like McGonagall, Flitwick, and Sprout would need to adapt their teaching significantly. McGonagall's strict but fair approach might work across cultures, but she'd need to learn different cultural contexts for understanding student behavior and motivation. Flitwick's enthusiasm for magic might be universally appealing, but he'd need to incorporate diverse magical traditions into his charms curriculum. Sprout would need to teach about magical plants from around the world, expanding far beyond the British and European plants she currently focuses on. Snape's approach, characterized by favoritism, intimidation, and abuse, wouldn't fly with an international student body and involved parents from multiple countries. He'd either need to fundamentally change or be removed. Probably the latter. Hagrid's Care of Magical Creatures class would become incredibly rich with students sharing knowledge of creatures from their home regions. A student from Australia could teach about drop bears, bunyips, and other magical creatures from down under. A student from Africa could explain about creatures that inhabit the diverse African ecosystems. Hagrid would need to be humble enough to learn from his students and incorporate their knowledge, which he might actually enjoy given his genuine love for all magical creatures. Though his tendency to underestimate danger would need to be reined in given increased parental and governmental oversight. The library would need massive expansion. Madam Pince would be managing a collection of magical texts from around the world, in dozens of languages, representing numerous magical traditions. The restricted section would be even more controversial, as different nations have different definitions of dark or dangerous magic. Some texts that Britain considers acceptable might be forbidden in other countries, and vice versa. Managing a library that serves such a diverse population, while respecting different national laws and sensibilities, would be extremely complex. Hopefully, Hogwarts would lean toward intellectual freedom, making texts available while teaching students to engage with ideas critically and ethically. Student publications and media would flourish. In addition to school newspapers, you might have students creating content in their native languages for audiences back home, reporting on life at Hogwarts from international perspectives. Social media, if magical teenagers have access to some equivalent, would be full of cross-cultural exchange, students sharing their experiences with friends and family worldwide. This could be positive publicity for Hogwarts and for international magical cooperation generally, showing the world that integration can work. But it also means that any problems at school, any incidents of racism or conflict, would be immediately broadcast worldwide, putting pressure on the administration to handle issues swiftly and effectively. Parent-teacher conferences and parent engagement would be complicated by distance and cultural differences. British parents can easily visit Hogwarts or meet with teachers in London. Parents from other continents would need port keys or other magical transport for visits, which wouldn't happen as frequently. Communication would mostly be by letter, magical video calls if such technology exists, or very occasional in-person meetings. Teachers would need to be sensitive to different parenting cultures and educational expectations. Some cultures expect very regular detailed updates on student progress. Others trust the school more completely. Some parents might be very involved in their children's education. Others might take a hands-off approach. Managing relationships with hundreds of families from different cultural backgrounds would require skilled communication and cultural competence from all staff. Graduation would be an incredible spectacle. Imagine a commencement ceremony with students in different cultural dress, families from every continent gathered together, speeches in multiple languages, celebrations reflecting diverse traditions. It would be a powerful statement about magical international unity and cooperation. Alumni would leave Hogwarts with friendships and connections spanning the globe, ready to build a more integrated magical world. The graduation ceremony might include performances representing different cultures, making it not just a formal academic event, but a cultural celebration. This brings us to perhaps the most important question: is all of this worth it? International integration of Hogwarts would create enormous challenges, costs, and complications. It would require massive resources, significant political will, constant effort to make it work. Students would face culture shock, discrimination, and difficulty. Staff would be overwhelmed managing complexity. The castle would need physical and magical renovation. Traditions would change or disappear. British students might feel they've lost something unique and special about their school. So is it worth it? The answer depends on your values and priorities. If you believe that magical education should serve primarily to preserve national magical cultures and traditions, then no, international Hogwarts isn't worth the cost. It would dilute British magical education and complicate what should be a straightforward process of training British magical children. If you prioritize simplicity, tradition, and cultural preservation, maintaining the current regional system makes sense. But if you believe that the magical world needs to become more integrated and cooperative to face global challenges, if you think that exposure to diversity makes individuals and societies stronger and more capable, if you value innovation and the cross-pollination of ideas, then yes, an international Hogwarts is worth pursuing despite the challenges. The students who graduate from an international Hogwarts would be uniquely prepared to build a better magical world, one less divided by nationalism and prejudice, more capable of cooperation, and more able to learn from diverse magical traditions. They'd be global citizens, comfortable navigating cultural differences, with networks and friendships spanning the world. These alumni would be the foundation of a transformed magical international community. Over time, the challenges would diminish. The first few years of international Hogwarts would be chaotic as everyone figures out how to make it work. But systems would develop, practices would be established, and both staff and students would adapt. Within a generation, an international Hogwarts would feel normal. Students would grow up expecting diversity and integration. The magical world would benefit from stronger international connections and reduced conflict. Innovation in magical research and practice would accelerate as different traditions interacted and combined. The pain of transition would give way to the benefits of integration. Perhaps most importantly, an international Hogwarts would strike a blow against the prejudice and insularity that plague the magical world. The Harry Potter series shows us a magical society riven by prejudice against Muggleborns, half-breeds, non-human magical beings, even prejudice between pure-blood families. These prejudices lead to conflict, persecution, and war. Education has the power to reduce prejudice by creating understanding and empathy. An international Hogwarts would teach students that magical ability and human worth transcend nationality, ethnicity, and culture. This lesson, learned during the formative years of adolescence, could reshape the magical world's culture over time, making it more just, more peaceful, and more cooperative. So maybe the real question isn't whether Hogwarts should accept international students, but whether the magical world is ready for it. Probably not, honestly. The magical world as depicted in the books is conservative, traditional, and resistant to change. The British Ministry of Magic can barely handle changes like werewolf rights or treating house elves ethically. International integration of its premier educational institution might be too radical a transformation to achieve politically. There would be massive resistance, from ministry officials, from pure-blood families, from those who profit from the current system, from people who simply fear change. But maybe that's exactly why it should happen. Transformative change doesn't occur because everyone's ready for it. It happens because visionaries push for it despite resistance. If a headmaster or headmistress with Dumbledore's wisdom but more political savvy, along with allies in the ministry and support from international magical governments, decided to pursue this vision, it could happen. It would be difficult and controversial, but it could reshape magical education and magical society for the better. And imagine what could be accomplished if not just Hogwarts, but schools worldwide embraced internationalism, breaking down barriers and building a truly global magical community. That's the world we're imagining here. A world where an 11-year-old girl from Tokyo and an 11-year-old boy from Lagos and an 11-year-old from London all receive letters inviting them to Hogwarts. They make the journey, however complicated, and find themselves in the great hall beneath the enchanted ceiling, waiting to be sorted. They might end up in different houses, but they're all part of the same community, learning together, growing together, building friendships that cross every boundary. They learn magic from professors representing diverse traditions. They celebrate each other's holidays and try each other's foods. They compete in Quidditch and academic tournaments. They navigate adolescence in all its awkwardness, with the added complexity of cultural differences. Some become friends for life. Others remain distant acquaintances. They all grow and change, becoming more than they would have been in a less diverse environment. When they graduate, they don't just leave Hogwarts. They leave transformed, carrying with them not just magical education, but deep cultural competence, international networks, and a vision of what the magical world could be. Some return to their home countries and work to make them more open and internationally engaged. Others pursue careers in international magical organizations, building the infrastructure of global magical cooperation. A few might even return to Hogwarts as professors, continuing the cycle and improving upon what they experienced. Over decades, these graduates reshape the magical world, making it more integrated, more cooperative, and more just. Conflicts that might have escalated into magical wars are resolved through diplomacy by leaders who formed friendships at Hogwarts. Magical innovation accelerates as researchers from different traditions collaborate freely. Prejudice declines, slowly but steadily, as exposure to diversity becomes normal rather than exceptional. Is this utopian? Yes, probably. The real world, magical or otherwise, is messy and complex. Not every problem can be solved through education and exposure. Some people maintain their prejudices despite evidence and experience. Cultural conflicts can be intractable. Power structures resist change. International cooperation is fragile and can collapse under pressure. An international Hogwarts would face all these challenges and more. There would be failures, conflicts, tragedies. Some students would have terrible experiences and leave damaged rather than enriched. Some initiatives would fail spectacularly. Some traditions would be lost that shouldn't have been. Progress would be uneven and contested at every step. But the effort would still be worthwhile. Even imperfect progress toward a more integrated and cooperative magical world would be valuable. Even if only some students benefited greatly from international exposure while others benefited marginally, that's still net positive. Even if the magical world became only somewhat more internationally engaged rather than fully transformed, that's better than remaining completely divided along national lines. Perfect shouldn't be the enemy of good, and good international education, even with all its challenges and imperfections, would be better than the segregated system currently in place. So what if Hogwarts accepted students from other countries? The castle would be more crowded and chaotic. The corridors would echo with dozens of languages. The Great Hall would be filled with diverse foods and faces. Classes would be enriched by multiple perspectives, but also complicated by diverse backgrounds. Students would struggle with homesickness, culture shock, and discrimination, but they'd also form unprecedented international friendships and gain invaluable cultural competence. The staff would be overwhelmed but also energized by the diversity. British magical society would be threatened but also transformed. The magical world globally would be challenged but also brought closer together. And Hogwarts itself would evolve from a British institution into something new. A truly global magical school preparing students not just to be British witches and wizards, but to be citizens of an interconnected magical world. Whether that's a change for the better depends on whether you believe the magical world needs to change at all, and whether the benefits of integration outweigh the costs of transformation. I think they do, but that's a question each person has to answer for themselves. What's certain is that the magical world, and Hogwarts especially, would never be the same.